Get comfortable, settle in, maybe grab a blanket and dim the lights a little, because we are about to spend a very long time inside the world of Resident Evil, and I want you to feel completely at home while we do it. Put your phone face down. Let the notifications wait. Whatever is happening out there in the world does not need your attention for the next couple of hours. Right now, the only thing on the agenda is Raccoon City, and Spencer Mansions, and laboratories beneath mountains, and a franchise that has been quietly extraordinary for 30 years. This is 175 facts about Resident Evil. Some of these you might already know. Some of them will genuinely surprise you. Some of them are strange production decisions made in a tiny Japanese office in 1994 that rippled forward and shaped the last 30 years of gaming history in ways nobody could have predicted. We are going to go through all of them slowly, with the kind of detail that turns a fun fact into an actual story, because that is always more interesting than just reading a list. A fact without context is just a number. A fact with context is a window into how things actually happened. There is something I find genuinely beautiful about spending time with the behind-the-scenes material of a franchise like this one. When you understand how Resident Evil actually got made, how many times it almost did not get made, how many versions of these games exist only as concept art or as brief demo footage on a promotional disc from 25 years ago, you start to see the finished games differently. Every choice that made it into the final product was a choice that survived hundreds of other ideas being discarded. The game you played was the result of an enormous amount of work, compromise, creativity, and sometimes genuinely wild luck. So, wherever you are right now, however you found this video, let us start from the very beginning. Section 1. Where it all started. Facts 1 through 15. Fact 1. The entire Resident Evil franchise exists because of a Nintendo Entertainment System game that Capcom no longer owned the rights to. In 1989, Capcom released a game in Japan called Sweet Home for the Famicom, the Japanese equivalent of the NES. Sweet Home was a horror role-playing game based on a Japanese horror film of the same name. It took place inside a haunted mansion. It had inventory management, exploration, puzzle solving, and a genuine sense of dread. Tokuro Fujiwara, who produced that game, considered it a masterpiece of horror design, something special that had never quite been done properly on a home console. Years later, when Fujiwara became a senior figure at Capcom, he gave a young director named Shinji Mikami a task: make something like Sweet Home, but for the PlayStation, and make it better than anything that had come before it. That task became Resident Evil. Everything: the mansions, the puzzles, the inventory management, the monsters hiding around corners. All of it traces back to a game from 1989 that most people outside Japan have never played. Fact 2. The game was not called Resident Evil in Japan, and still is not. In its home country, the franchise goes by the name Biohazard, written phonetically as Biohazardo. That name was always the preferred title for the creators, and it makes thematic sense. The story is literally about biological hazards. The problem came when Capcom prepared to release the game internationally. A Capcom employee in the United States discovered that the name Biohazard was already being used by both an American video game and an American band. Using it would have created legal complications and trademark conflicts. Capcom needed a new title for the Western market, and so they held an internal contest among their staff members. Hundreds of ideas were submitted. The winning entry was Resident Evil. The title was chosen partly because the setting of the first game is a mansion, and the idea of evil being resident inside that building carried a poetic logic to it. Fact 3. The man responsible for naming the game thought the name was terrible. Chris Kramer, who was the director of communications at Capcom at the time, later recalled in interviews that when Resident Evil was announced as the winner of the internal contest, his immediate reaction was that it sounded cheesy. He said he could not think of a better alternative, which was part of why he did not fight it harder, but his personal feeling was that the title was not particularly strong. The rest of the marketing team disagreed completely. They loved it. They argued that it fit the game's energy, its B-movie sensibility, and its carnival horror aesthetic. Mikami himself, after some persuasion, agreed the name worked. Kramer eventually came around. And so, the franchise that would go on to sell more than 170 million copies worldwide got its international name because one man lost an internal argument. Fact 4. The first Resident Evil started development in 1993 as a Super Nintendo game before anyone had touched a PlayStation. The early concept pitched by Tokuro Fujiwara was meant to be a horror game for the Super Famicom, taking direct mechanical inspiration from Sweet Home. The project evolved rapidly once Capcom gained access to Sony's new PlayStation hardware. The possibilities of the 32-bit system were so far beyond what the Super Nintendo could offer that the development team shifted targets completely. The game's entire visual philosophy, the pre-rendered backgrounds, the fixed camera angles, the cinematic presentation, all of that was born from the decision to move to PlayStation. Fact 5. The very first version of Resident Evil was meant to be a first-person game. Before anyone settled on the third-person fixed camera design that would define the franchise, Shinji Mikami's team was experimenting with a full first-person perspective, with a heads-up display similar to what you would find in games like Doom, which was enormously influential at the time. The PlayStation's hardware simply could not run it well enough. The combination of rendering a first-person view with detailed environments, multiple enemies, and smooth frame rates was beyond what the system could reliably handle in 1993 and 1994. The team was forced to find an alternative approach, and that alternative became the iconic fixed-camera third-person perspective the series would use for its first 3 mainline entries. It is a beautiful irony that when Resident Evil 7 launched in 2017 with a first-person perspective, it was actually fulfilling an original vision from 23 years earlier. Fact 6. The original Resident Evil also had a planned cooperative multiplayer mode. Early footage shown at the 1995 V-Jump Festival in Japan featured both Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine on screen simultaneously, exploring the Spencer mansion together. The PlayStation's hardware limitations struck again. Running 2 fully animated character models alongside all the enemies and environmental detail the team wanted proved too demanding. Mikami himself later stated that beyond the technical issues, the co-op gameplay itself just was not good enough at that point in development. The mechanics did not produce the kind of tense, frightening experience the team wanted. Cooperative play did not appear in a mainline Resident Evil title until Resident Evil 5 in 2009. 14 years after that original vision was scrapped. Fact 7. The zombies in the Spencer Mansion laboratory were deliberately designed to be naked. This was not an artistic choice about horror. It was a technical workaround. The development team was working with a limited polygon budget, and clothing required additional geometry and texture work that consumed resources they needed elsewhere. By making certain zombie models unclothed, they reduced the polygon count enough to keep the game running smoothly without sacrificing the visual quality of the environments and other elements they cared more about. Necessity, as always, became invention. Fact 8. The live-action footage in the original game's opening cutscene was filmed using amateur actors. When Capcom decided to open Resident Evil with a live-action sequence to give the game a cinematic, film-like quality, they needed actors who could speak English on short notice. The game was being developed in Japan. The solution was to hire American expatriates living in Tokyo, based entirely on their availability rather than any professional acting experience. The actors were given only 2 takes for every scene, which directly contributed to the stilted, awkward delivery that became genuinely beloved by fans over the years. Nobody walking into that production thought they were creating something that people would still be quoting and imitating 3 decades later. Fact 9. The original game featured a pop singer's music in its Japanese release. On the insistence of producer Tokuro Fujiwara, Capcom negotiated a deal with the agent of an up-and-coming Japanese singer named Fumitaka Fuchigami to include 2 of his songs in the initial Japanese version of Biohazard. The songs were titled Yume de Owara Senai and Kori no Manazashi. The development team was reportedly not enthusiastic about this addition, feeling it clashed with the horror atmosphere they were building. When the game was localized for international release, those songs were replaced entirely. The pop music never made it outside Japan. Fact 10. The American version of the original game was deliberately made harder than the Japanese original. Shinji Mikami, at the request of the American localization team, cranked up the difficulty level for the North American release. The reasoning was practical. Capcom wanted the game to have enough challenge that American players could not simply rent it for a weekend and complete it. Rentals were a massive part of how American consumers experienced games in the 1990s, and a game that could be finished in a rental period was seen as damaging to retail sales. Mikami later admitted that this adjusted version was quite difficult, even for experienced Capcom staff to complete. Fact at 11. The cover art for the North American and European versions of the original Resident Evil was created by Bill Sienkiewicz, a highly regarded comic book artist known for his work on Marvel properties, including Daredevil and New Mutants. Sienkiewicz's painted style gave the box art a distinctive, nightmarish quality that stood out dramatically on store shelves. It was not a screenshot. It was not a rendered image of the characters from the game. It was a piece of original painted horror art, and it communicated the game's tone more effectively than any screenshot could have. Fact 12. The development of Resident Evil took 27 months. The original estimate had been 18 to 24 months. The extra time was consumed largely by the challenges of working with PlayStation hardware that the team had never used before. They spent the first 6 months of development essentially just learning how the system worked and hitting obstacles where their technical ambitions exceeded what was actually possible. Every time they came up with a design idea that seemed essential, they would discover a hardware constraint that forced them to rethink it. The fixed camera system, the pre-rendered backgrounds, the way the game handled loading between areas, all of these were solutions to problems that emerged from that first year of struggle with unfamiliar technology. Fact 13. In an early version of the game, the laboratory featured a poster of the Street Fighter character Chun-Li on the wall. Director Hideki Kamiya confirmed in interviews that this Easter egg existed during development but was removed before the final version shipped. Kamiya felt it was too tonally inconsistent with the world they were building. The serious, horror-focused atmosphere of Raccoon City's secret underground laboratory did not benefit from having a fighting game character pinned to the wall. Fact 14. The name Raccoon City was not always the plan. Early in development, the fictional American city at the center of the Resident Evil universe was referred to internally as Harnby. At some point before the final release, the name was changed to Raccoon City. There is a popular theory among fans that the city was named after the tanuki, a Japanese raccoon dog that features prominently in folklore and pop culture, but Capcom has indicated the name was chosen specifically to reference the North American animal. Whatever the origin, Raccoon City became one of gaming's most iconic fictional locations, a place so vividly realized across multiple games that it feels as real as any fictional city in film or television. Fact 15. The franchise has now sold more than 170 million copies worldwide as of March 2025, making it Capcom's best-selling property of all time and the single best-selling horror game franchise in the history of the medium. To put that number in perspective, the combined population of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom is roughly 220 million people. The Resident Evil series has sold to more than 3/4 of that number. It has outlasted the hardware that created it by 3 decades, survived multiple creative reinventions that could have destroyed it, and remained continuously relevant from the PlayStation 1 era through the PlayStation 5 generation. It all started with one producer missing a game he used to make, and that is 15 facts in the books. Before we keep going, I want to say something to everyone watching right now. If you are enjoying this, drop a comment below telling me what time it is where you are and what part of the world you are watching from. I genuinely love reading those, and it is a nice reminder that people from all kinds of places end up in the same strange corner of the internet at the same strange hours. And if you want more videos like this, subscribing helps more than you might think. It keeps the channel going and makes sure you do not miss the next one. All right, 15 down, 160 to go. Let us keep moving. Section 2, Making the Impossible Game. Facts 16 through 35. Fact 16. The English voice acting in the original Resident Evil was recorded almost entirely as an afterthought. The game had been developed with Japanese audio throughout its entire production. It was only as the game neared completion and Capcom prepared for its North American release that someone realized there was no English voice work in the game at all, which would be a significant obstacle for Western players. American actors were rapidly brought to Japan, given the scripts, and recorded under serious time pressure. Each actor was given only 2 takes per line. There was limited time for direction, limited time for revision, and limited opportunity to make the performances feel natural. The result was dialogue that became legendary for all the wrong reasons at the time and all the right reasons in retrospect. Fact 17. The line, "Jill, here is a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you," was written exactly as it appears in the game. Barry Burton's gift of a lockpick to Jill Valentine, accompanied by that line of dialogue, was not a translation error or a script oversight. The line was written in English by Capcom's localization team, recorded by a voice actor who delivered it with complete sincerity and passed through whatever review process existed at the time without anyone raising a significant objection. It is now one of the most quoted lines in gaming history. The actor who voiced Barry Gerde, could not have known. Fact 18. Jill Valentine's design in the original game was influenced by Julia Souza, a character from the Japanese television program Sweet Home, who wore a distinctive blue tube top. The connection to Sweet Home, the original game that inspired Resident Evil, ran so deep that even the visual design of the protagonists pulled from that source material. Jill's outfit in the original game, the blue tube top and mini skirt combination, was a direct aesthetic nod to that earlier work. Fact 19. Chris Redfield was originally intended to be a smoker. In the Japanese version of the original game's opening live-action cutscene, Chris can be seen smoking a cigarette. This scene was cut for the international release, with shots of the cigarette removed from the North American and European versions. The edits were made to remove content considered potentially objectionable for Western audiences. In a later director's cut release that was marketed as including the original uncensored footage, those cigarette scenes were still absent because of a miscommunication between Capcom Japan and Capcom USA during the localization process. The uncensored cut was eventually offered as a free download, but the whole situation became a minor controversy about honesty in marketing. Fact 20. Albert Wesker was not originally conceived as a traitor. When the Resident Evil production team was still early in the design of the game's characters, their vision of the STAR's commander was of a straightforward ally. It was the team's co-workers who suggested the twist of making the authority figure secretly corrupt. That suggestion was adopted and developed into the character who became one of gaming's most iconic antagonists. The traitor angle fundamentally changed everything about Wesker's role in the story, transforming him from a supporting character into the narrative engine that has driven the entire franchise for 30 years. Fact 21. The Spencer Mansion's architecture was partly inspired by the works of Italian architect Giovanni Battista Piranesi, known for his elaborate, fantastical etchings of imaginary prisons. Piranesi's work features labyrinthine structures with impossible staircases, overwhelming scale, and a sense of being trapped inside something incomprehensibly large. The design team wanted the Spencer Mansion to feel like a space that should not exist. Too large, too elaborate, with rooms that did not quite connect the way a normal building would. That architectural uncanniness was intentional, and it drew from the same tradition of design disorientation that Piranesi explored in his art. Fact 22. The game's producer Tokuro Fujiwara insisted on including a live-action opening sequence because he believed it would help the game sell in Japan. He felt that having recognizable cinematic presentation elements, even low-budget ones, would signal to consumers that this was a serious entertainment product and not simply a game in the traditional sense. The American actors shot in Tokyo were specifically selected to make the game feel international, a strategy that Japanese publishers in the 1990s sometimes used to position their products as global entertainment rather than domestic software. Fact 23. Resident Evil was originally developed by a team Capcom called Team Horror, which was largely made up of newcomers within the company. Shinji Mikami himself had previously been directing Disney tie-in games, including Goof Troop for the Super Nintendo. His transition from a game where you play as Goofy solving puzzles to a survival horror game set in a zombie-infested mansion represents one of the more dramatic creative pivots in gaming history. The inexperience of the team was, in some ways, an asset. They had not developed the kind of institutional knowledge that would have told them some of their more ambitious ideas were impossible. Fact 24. Capcom did not use motion capture technology for the original Resident Evil, despite having their own motion capture studio available. Instead, the animation team referred to books, reference videos, and physical demonstrations to study how people moved, how animals moved, how spiders walked, and how various creatures might behave. The spiders in the game's laboratory section were animated by people studying actual spiders and attempting to translate those movements into the game's limited polygon environment by hand. Fact 25. The Cerberus dogs that appear in the Spencer Mansion were one of the most technically challenging enemies in the original game. The team needed the dogs to move convincingly on 4 legs while navigating the pre-rendered environments. They studied reference footage of real dogs extensively. The famous opening jump scare where a zombie dog crashes through a window was designed specifically to establish early in the game that threats could come from unexpected directions, not just the corridors ahead. Fact 26. The inventory system in Resident Evil was directly inspired by Sweet Home's item management mechanics. Sweet Home required players to carefully manage a limited set of tools and supplies, creating anxiety around every pickup decision. Mikami's team took that anxiety and amplified it by attaching it to survival mechanics, where running out of ammunition or using your last herb at the wrong moment could put the entire game in jeopardy. The briefcase inventory of Resident Evil 4 is a direct evolutionary descendant of those original Sweet Home mechanics, just reskinned and redesigned for a new era. Fact 27. There was an early version of the Spencer Mansion that included a graveyard that was eventually cut from the game. The graveyard appeared in early preview coverage and was a planned part of the outdoor area around the mansion. It was removed before the final release but was not forgotten. When the 2002 GameCube remake of Resident Evil was produced, the graveyard was brought back and included in the rebuilt mansion environment, finally making it into the canonical version of the space nearly 6 years after it was originally designed. Fact 28. The original Resident Evil's guest houses and a planned tower were replaced during development by the game's guardhouse and laboratory sections, respectively. The team went through multiple iterations of the mansion's supporting structures before settling on the final layout. Some of these removed areas show up in early preview screenshots and promotional materials, showing a version of the Spencer Mansion that is noticeably different from what players eventually experienced. Fact 29. The original game was released in Japan on March 22, 1996, in North America on April 1st, and in Europe on August 16th of that same year. The North American release date landing on April Fool's Day was coincidental. It shipped on that date simply because the localization work was completed and the manufacturing and distribution pipeline delivered it to stores. Nobody at Capcom or Sony chose April 1st as a deliberate date. Fact 30. The Resident Evil 2002 GameCube remake was directed by Koji Oda and took roughly 2 years to produce. The team used Capcom's then-current technology to completely rebuild every environment, character model, and piece of architecture from the original game, while remaining entirely faithful to the original's layouts and design. The remake is widely regarded as one of the finest remakes in gaming history, and arguably the definitive version of the original Resident Evil experience. Its director later noted that the team consulted with Shinji Mikami extensively to ensure they were honoring his original vision while taking advantage of the technological capabilities that had not existed during the first game's development. Fact 31. The original Resident Evil sold approximately 5 million copies on the PlayStation and was considered a significant commercial success for Capcom. The franchise's first 2 games had collectively sold approximately 11 million units worldwide by March 1999, just 3 years after launch. Those numbers were impressive enough that Capcom greenlit multiple simultaneous follow-up projects, which created the complicated multi-game development environment that produced Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil Code Veronica, and Resident Evil 0, all within a relatively short window of each other. Fact 32. The Tyrant T-002 from the original game was designed as the culmination of Umbrella's Tyrant research up to that point. The concept of a bioweapon that resembled a human being but had been pushed past human limits, taller, more powerful, less controllable, became a template for every major boss creature that followed. The original tyrant's design, the elongated limbs, the exposed heart, the single massive claw, established a visual language for Umbrella's most dangerous products that persists across the entire franchise. Fact 33. The Spencer Mansion's elaborate puzzle design, rooms locked by crests, medallions hidden inside paintings, secret passages opened by manipulating statues, was a deliberate homage to the escape room-like architecture of the haunted houses in old Japanese horror fiction. Mikami grew up reading horror manga and watching horror films that frequently used elaborate, trap-filled settings as a way of making every physical space dangerous. The mansion's puzzles were meant to communicate that the building itself was hostile, not just the creatures inside it. Fact 34. Rebecca Chambers, the medic character who appears in the original game when playing as Chris, was the youngest member of the STARS team at 18 years old. Despite her age, she was presented as a competent professional who had genuine expertise in biology and field medicine. She later became the protagonist of Resident Evil Zero, which serves as a prequel to the original game and shows her first day in the field, the night before the events of Resident Evil. Her design and characterization were meant to represent a kind of optimistic innocence that the horrors of Raccoon City would systematically dismantle. Fact 35. The Arklay Mountains, the fictional mountain range in the American Midwest where the Spencer Mansion sits, were designed to feel isolated and unreachable by normal society. The decision to set the first game in a remote wilderness location, rather than an urban setting, was made to control the scope of the story. A zombie outbreak in a mansion in the mountains could be explained away, covered up, contained. Umbrella's ability to use the isolated location as a testing ground while avoiding public attention was only possible because of how deliberately cut off the mansion was from everything else. That sense of remote, deniable horror established a recurring motif that the franchise would return to across multiple entries. Section 3. The Ghost Version, Facts 36 through 55. Fact 36. There is a version of Resident Evil 2 that you will never play, and it was approximately 70% complete when Capcom decided to throw it away. Fans call it Resident Evil 1.5, though that was never an official title. This version of the game was the original sequel to Resident Evil, developed by Hideki Kamiya with a different story, different characters, different locations, and a different vision for what the series should become. Leon S. Kennedy was present in both versions, but his role and characterization differed significantly. Instead of Claire Redfield, Elza Walker was the second protagonist, a college student and motorcycle enthusiast with a personality distinct from Claire's. Fact 37. The reason Resident Evil 1.5 was scrapped was that Shinji Mikami, serving as producer, played through the build and found it dull. That was his specific assessment. The game was the equivalent of any other common game. For a sequel to a franchise built on atmosphere and dread, being common was the worst possible outcome. The game had interesting ideas, but the execution was not producing the level of horror and tension that the original had achieved. The script, written by Kamiya without the assistance of a professional screenwriter, was also identified as needing substantial work. Mikami brought in Noboru Sugimura, a professional television writer who had worked as head writer on Super Sentai, to look at the existing script. Sugimura's assessment was that it should simply be rewritten entirely rather than revised. Capcom agreed, and the process of rebuilding from the foundation began. Fact 38. Resident Evil 1.5 had a steel pipe as a melee weapon. This is one of the specific details that director Hideki Kamiya confirmed in interviews. The game had begun experimenting with close-range combat options, allowing players to use environmental items to fight zombies at close quarters. When the script was thrown out and the game was rebuilt, this feature went with it. Writer Noboru Sugimura felt strongly that giving players a repeatable melee weapon changed the psychological relationship between the player and the zombies in a way that damaged the horror. If you had a steel pipe you could use as many times as you wanted, approaching zombies stopped being scary. Distance from the threat was part of the design philosophy, and Sugimura argued passionately that maintaining that distance was essential. Fact 39. Elza Walker was essentially transformed into Claire Redfield. When the game was rebuilt from scratch, the creative team decided that the second protagonist should have a concrete connection to someone from the original game, rather than being a fresh character unconnected to the existing story. Elsa was a college student on a motorcycle who had no prior connection to Raccoon City or its mysteries. Claire became the sister of Chris Redfield, which immediately embedded her in the lore, gave her a reason to be in the city, and created emotional stakes around her story. Elsa's design was largely preserved in Claire, including the motorcycle and the youthful energy. Capcom even included Elsa Walker as a downloadable costume for Claire in the Resident Evil 2 remake released in 2019, acknowledging the character's existence and her connection to the game that replaced her. Fact 40. The character Ada Wong was originally a researcher who wore a white lab coat in Resident Evil 1.5. Her transformation into the red dress-wearing spy with mysterious allegiances and a deep, ambiguous relationship with Leon was entirely a product of the rebuild. Ada as she exists, the femme fatale intelligence operative who has appeared across multiple games and remains one of the franchise's most beloved and complicated characters, would not exist if Resident Evil 1.5 had shipped as intended. She is entirely a creation of the rewrite. Fact 41. The rebuilt Resident Evil 2 was developed in approximately 1 year and 9 months by a team of 40 to 50 people. This is a remarkably compact development period, given the scale and quality of what was produced. The pressure was intense. The game had already been delayed significantly by the scrapping of Resident Evil 1.5, and Capcom needed to deliver. Director Hideki Kamiya has spoken about how the team worked extraordinarily long hours during this period, and how the pressure of knowing the entire franchise's future was riding on this one game shaped every decision. Fact 42. To apologize to players for the delay caused by scrapping Resident Evil 1.5 and rebuilding the game from scratch, Capcom shipped the director's cut version of the original Resident Evil with a playable preview disc of the new Resident Evil 2 included in the package. This was an unusually direct acknowledgement of the situation by Capcom's standards. They essentially admitted that the sequel had been delayed, packaged a preview of it as compensation, and used the opportunity to promote the new game at the same time. The preview disc became a collector's item and gave fans their first real look at what Resident Evil 2 would become. Fact 43. Resident Evil 2 introduced the Licker, a skinless creature that crawls along ceilings and walls. The Licker was designed to be a kind of evolutionary horror reveal, showing players what a human infected with the T-virus could become if the mutation progressed beyond the initial zombie stage. The name came from the creature's extraordinary long tongue, which it uses as an attack. The Licker's design was deliberately inverted from humanoid comfort zones, placing the exposed brain, the absent eyes, and the elongated skeletal structure in combinations that created maximum unease. Fact 44. The zapping system in Resident Evil 2, the mechanic by which players could choose to play either Leon's campaign or Claire's campaign first, with the choice affecting certain events in both, was created after the game was already substantially in development. It was not part of the original design. Director Hideki Kamiya was inspired by the way Resident Evil had handled its two protagonists across separate campaigns and wanted to create something more interconnected. The zapping system introduced the idea that characters from different perspectives were physically occupying the same space, and that one character's actions could leave consequences that the other would encounter. It is one of the most elegant narrative mechanics in the franchise's history. Fact 45. William Birkin, the scientist who infected himself with the G-virus and mutated into the game's major antagonist, was designed with a specific emotional logic in mind. Birkin was a man who had devoted his entire life to his work, who had sacrificed his family relationships and normal human connection for his research, and who, when faced with losing that work, chose to destroy himself rather than surrender it. His mutation was meant to be simultaneously monstrous and tragic, the physical manifestation of someone who valued their creation so completely that they merged with it. The G-virus eye that gradually replaces parts of his body was a recurring visual metaphor for obsession-consuming identity. Fact 46. The Raccoon Police Station, which serves as the primary setting for Resident Evil 2, was designed to have been originally an art museum. Environmental storytelling elements throughout the station hint at its previous life as a cultural institution, with elaborate architectural details that would be unusual for a working police department. The reimagination of the space from museum to police station also explains some of the building's stranger layouts, rooms that seem ornate beyond practical necessity, corridors that curve for aesthetic rather than functional reasons. Fact 47. Resident Evil 2 sold approximately 5 million copies in its first 2 years of release, making it the franchise's most successful title on a single platform at that time. It shipped in January 1998 in the United States and Japan, backed by what Capcom described as one of their largest marketing campaigns to date. The game outsold expectations significantly and established Resident Evil 2 as not just a successful sequel, but potentially the definitive entry in the early franchise. The 2019 remake, which reimagined the game for modern hardware, eventually eclipsed that original with over 15 million copies sold, making it the best-selling single entry in the franchise as of mid-2025. Fact 48. The title screen of the original Resident Evil 2 features a giant eye. Director Hideki Kamiya later confirmed via social media that this eye belongs to William Birkin, also known simply as G. The eye is not shown in its original human context, but rather in its mutated state, a visual teaser for the creature that would serve as the game's primary antagonist. In the Resident Evil 1.5 prototype, the eye on the title screen was simply generic and unconnected to any specific character or creature. Fact 49. Sherry Birkin, the young daughter of William and Annette Birkin, who becomes a key character in Resident Evil 2, was designed to represent the human cost of Umbrella's experiments in the most personal terms possible. She is literally the child of the people responsible for the outbreak that destroyed Raccoon City. Her presence in the story was meant to complicate the simple good versus evil framing by putting a frightened, innocent child at the center of events that her parents caused. Her later appearances in Resident Evil 6 as an adult government agent carry the full weight of that backstory. Fact 50. Annette Birkin's role in Resident Evil 2 was significantly more prominent in the Resident Evil 1.5 prototype. In the scrapped version, she was intended to serve as a supporting character who would assist the protagonists on multiple occasions, providing information and limited help in navigating the facilities. Her role was dramatically reduced in the rebuilt game, where she appears mostly as an obstacle or a source of exposition about her husband's experiments. Her characterization was also revisited substantially in the 2019 remake, which added emotional depth to her relationship with Sherry and her complicated feelings about William's choices. Fact 51. The Nintendo 64 port of Resident Evil 2 was considered technically miraculous by the gaming press of the time. Resident Evil 2 was a PlayStation game using compressed full-motion video and pre-rendered backgrounds, content types that required significant storage capacity and were not naturally suited to a cartridge-based system. The development team worked extensively with compression technology and cartridge design to make the game fit on the N64 medium. The result was considered an impressive technical achievement, though the compressed audio and video quality were noticeably reduced compared to the PlayStation version. Fact 52. Brian Irons, the corrupt police chief who serves as a secondary villain in Resident Evil 2, was not originally corrupt. In the Resident Evil 1.5 version of the game, Irons was designed as an upstanding law enforcement officer who fought genuinely and bravely to protect the Raccoon police station. He was planned as a support character who would periodically assist Leon through the game's story. His transformation into a morally compromised villain who was secretly receiving payments from Umbrella to cover up their activities was entirely a product of the rebuild. The switch from hero to villain gave the police station a pervasive atmosphere of institutional failure that added a layer of social commentary the original conception lacked. Fact 53. The infamous alligator boss fight in Resident Evil 2 was added specifically to give players a memorable, spectacular moment in the game's sewer section. The sewers were, practically speaking, one of the less visually interesting environments in the game. The team wanted something that would make players stop thinking about how much they disliked sewers and start thinking about survival. A massive alligator dropping from above and lunging at the player in a confined space accomplished that goal effectively. Fact 54. Resident Evil 2 was ported to the Game.com handheld by Tiger Electronics, producing one of the more notorious bad game ports in the franchise's history. The Game.com was a severely limited device with a tiny processor, a very small black and white screen, and almost no storage capacity. The port of Resident Evil 2 for this platform removed almost everything from the game, reducing it to a simplified experience that retained almost none of the atmosphere or gameplay that made the original work. It remains a curiosity in the franchise's history, an artifact of the era when publishers ported anything they could to any device that might generate a royalty. Fact 55. The development of Resident Evil 2 required photographing the interiors of Western-style buildings in Japanese cities to serve as reference for the redesigned environments. Since relatively few assets from Resident Evil 1.5 could be reused, the art team needed to essentially rebuild every major location from scratch. They used photographs of actual architectural spaces as reference to make the environments feel grounded and believable. The Raccoon Police Station's ornate design drew from buildings that had been constructed in Japan during a period of Western architectural influence, creating spaces that felt both realistic and slightly dreamlike. Section 4. Raccoon City's Final Hours, Facts 56 through 75. Fact 56. Resident Evil 3 only exists because of a business obligation Capcom had made with Sony. When Resident Evil became a franchise, Capcom entered into an arrangement with Sony that involved delivering 3 numbered Resident Evil entries to the PlayStation platform. After completing Resident Evil 2, Capcom was planning to make what would eventually become Code Veronica, the true third mainline entry. But Code Veronica was in development for the Sega Dreamcast. Delivering it as Resident Evil 3 on a Sony competitor would have been awkward and contractually complicated. Rather than break the agreement, Capcom took a game that had been in development as a side project and elevated it to the third numbered entry. The game that would have been a spin-off became Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Code Veronica, which many fans consider the superior game, shipped without a number on a competing platform. Fact 57. The Nemesis was originally conceived as a slime creature. When Shinji Mikami and director Kazuhiro Aoyama first discussed the idea of a persistent stalker enemy for Resident Evil 3, they explored the concept of a liquid metal creature similar to the T-1000 from Terminator 2, Judgment Day. The idea was that this creature could bypass obstacles, slide under doors, and reform after taking damage. The development team found that this concept, while frightening in theory, was too amorphous. There was no recognizable shape for the player to identify, no coherent sense of what they were running from. The stalker aspect was lost. They started over, anchoring the concept in the Tyrant design from the original game and building upward from there. Fact 58. The Nemesis can say exactly one word in the original Resident Evil 3. That word is stars. The creature was designed with the specific mission of eliminating the surviving members of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service before they could expose Umbrella's activities. Its ability to articulate the name of its targets was a deliberate design choice meant to communicate that this creature was operating with a level of intelligence and intentionality that went beyond other bioweapons. Every time players heard that single rasping word through a hallway, they knew exactly what was coming and had a limited amount of time to prepare. Fact 59. Resident Evil 3's development team toyed with the idea of letting players control a zombified version of Brad Vickers. Brad, a STARS helicopter pilot who appears in the original Resident Evil and makes a cameo in Resident Evil 2 as a zombie, was planned to be playable in Resident Evil 3 in his undead state. The concept was ultimately dropped because the game was designed with a relatively limited budget, and building an entirely new playable experience around the zombie Brad character exceeded what was financially viable for the project. Fact 60. The Raccoon City outbreak was caused, at its most fundamental level, by a rat. William Birkin infected himself with the G virus when Umbrella's security operatives attempted to confiscate his research. The operatives shot him and left him for dead. Rats in the facility gnawed on the dead and injured operatives and on Birkin himself. Those rats then entered Raccoon City's sewer system, carrying T-virus contamination from the soldiers' bodies. The contamination eventually reached the city's water supply. The entire catastrophe that destroyed a city of tens of thousands of people and set in motion the events of 2 full games, traces back to rats in a sewer and one scientist who refused to let go of his life's work. Fact 61. Raccoon City is located in the fictional Midwestern United States. Capcom has never officially specified which Midwestern state the city occupies, and this ambiguity appears to be intentional. Over the years, various promotional materials, novelizations, and supplementary sources have offered slightly different geographic hints. Fan consensus, based on environmental details and the presence of the Arklay Mountains, places the city somewhere in a landlocked Midwestern state, but Capcom has consistently avoided committing to a specific location. In the 2019 Resident Evil 2 remake, the skyline in the background of certain outdoor areas was based on Montreal, Quebec in central Canada, though the game's fiction still presents the city as American. Fact 62. The destruction of Raccoon City at the end of Resident Evil 3 via a thermobaric missile strike was a late addition to the game's story. Writer Yasuhisa Kawamura, who developed the script, originally envisioned the city being destroyed by a napalm bombing, an idea borrowed from one of the Resident Evil drama albums produced as supplementary material. Kawamura felt napalm was insufficiently climactic for a conclusion to the city's story. He pushed for something more dramatic, something that would signal definitively that this chapter was closed. A specialized government weapon delivered from orbit communicated the scale of how seriously the United States government was treating the situation and how completely they intended to erase what had happened. Fact 63. The timeline of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 overlap. Resident Evil 3 begins approximately 24 hours before the events of Resident Evil 2 and concludes a couple of days after Resident Evil 2 ends. Both games are set during the same week of September and early October 1998, with different characters navigating different parts of the same dying city. The overlap was deliberate, intended to create a sense of the outbreak as a sprawling, citywide disaster that no single person could experience in its entirety. Leon and Claire's story and Jill's story were happening simultaneously in the same burning city, and neither set of characters was aware of the other. Fact 64. The Resident Evil Outbreak games, released for PlayStation 2 in 2003 and 2004, told the story of ordinary Raccoon City civilians trying to survive the outbreak from perspectives that had nothing to do with Stars, Umbrella, or any of the franchise's established heroes. The games were notable for their online multiplayer functionality, which was still relatively uncommon for console horror games at the time. They featured a cast of civilian characters, including a bartender, a nurse, a college student, a retired athlete, and a reporter, each with unique abilities reflecting their backgrounds. The Outbreak games have a devoted fan base who consider them among the most emotionally resonant entries in the franchise, precisely because the stakes feel different when the protagonist is just a regular person trying to survive. Fact 65. The Tyrant program, Umbrella's effort to create mass-producible humanoid bioweapons, was hindered for years by a fundamental biological problem. Very few humans possess the genetic profile necessary to survive T-virus injection and undergo Tyrant transformation without dying from the process. The incompatibility rate was enormous. Most test subjects simply died. One of the ways Umbrella worked around this problem was by obtaining clones of a man named Sergei Vladimir, a former Soviet military officer who happened to carry the rare genetic profile necessary for compatibility. His clones were used as the base for the T-103 Tyrant series, which is the series that produced Mr. X in Resident Evil 2. Fact 66. The Resident Evil franchise introduced the concept of the stalker enemy to mainstream gaming with the Tyrant at the end of the original game, and then expanded it dramatically with Nemesis in Resident Evil 3. The design principle of an enemy that cannot be permanently defeated by normal means, that will keep returning, that will pursue the player through multiple areas rather than staying in one room, fundamentally changed how horror games thought about antagonist design. This design lineage runs directly from the original Tyrant through Nemesis to Mr. X in the Resident Evil 2 remake to Lady Dimitrescu in Resident Evil Village, and has influenced countless horror games outside the franchise as well. Fact 67. The Resident Evil film series that began in 2002 with Paul W.S. Anderson directing a film starring Mila Jovovich is the highest-grossing video game film adaptation franchise in history, having made more than $1.2 billion across 6 films. The films are almost universally considered terrible adaptations of the source material by fans of the games. They introduce an original protagonist named Alice, who has no equivalent in the games. They drastically alter the lore and settings of the franchise, and they increasingly prioritize action spectacle over horror atmosphere as the series progresses. And yet they made over $1 billion. The franchise's name alone was powerful enough to sustain a film series that bore almost no resemblance to what players had experienced. Fact 68. Carlos Oliveira, the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service mercenary who helps Jill Valentine in Resident Evil 3, was designed to represent a different kind of mercenary character than the franchise had shown before. He was hired muscle for a deeply corrupt organization who had genuine moral convictions that eventually led him to act against his employer's interests. The UBCS was staffed partly with former Soviet military personnel and nationalist paramilitaries recruited from post-Cold War Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Carlos represented the human cost of working in that environment, while retaining enough agency to choose differently when it mattered. Fact 69. Nikolai Zinoviev, the corrupt mercenary supervisor in Resident Evil 3, was designed as a deliberate contrast to Carlos. Where Carlos ultimately proved that working for Umbrella did not have to define your morality, Nikolai demonstrated that it could. He was an opportunist who accepted money from Umbrella to collect combat data on bioweapons during the outbreak, which meant allowing the crisis to continue, and documenting the effectiveness of various monsters and killing trained soldiers. His character was a dark mirror of Carlos. Same environment, same resources, opposite choices. Fact 70. The development of Resident Evil Code, Veronica for the Sega Dreamcast, represented a significant creative ambition for the franchise. It was the first Resident Evil game to use fully real-time three-dimensional graphics for both characters and environments, abandoning the pre-rendered background technology that the series had used since its inception. The game was also notable for being the first to explicitly tie together plot threads from the first and second games in a single story, with Claire Redfield and Chris Redfield both appearing and the Umbrella narrative advancing to a new stage. It is also the game that brought Albert Wesker back after his apparent death in the original Resident Evil, revealing that he had survived his injuries by injecting himself with an experimental virus. Fact 71. The Ashford family, who serve as the primary villains of Code Veronica, were designed as a commentary on aristocratic obsession and the corruption of legacy. Edward Ashford was one of the original founders of Umbrella alongside Oswell Spencer and James Marcus. His descendants, Alfred and Alexia, grew up surrounded by the legacy of Umbrella's founding generation and developed a profoundly unhealthy relationship with that heritage. Alfred's psychological instability and Alexia's cold scientific brilliance were meant to represent two different ways that being born into monstrous privilege could damage a human being's development. Fact 72. Alexia Ashford deliberately infected herself with the T. Veronica virus and then placed herself in cryogenic suspension for 15 years because she understood that the virus needed time to bond with her biology without killing her. She calculated that if she allowed her metabolism to slow to near zero during the integration process, her immune system would not trigger the acute rejection response that killed most T. Veronica hosts. She was right. When she woke up 15 years later, she had absorbed the virus and gained abilities that exceeded anything Umbrella had previously achieved. The willingness to sacrifice 15 years of her life and to trust in her own theoretical calculations completely was presented as both a mark of exceptional intellect and profound, chilling arrogance. Fact 73. The Raccoon City destruction incident, as the franchise formally calls the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3, is treated within the game's lore as the turning point in Umbrella's history. Before the outbreak, Umbrella operated as a publicly traded pharmaceutical corporation with subsidiaries and a legal presence in multiple countries. The undeniable scale of the Raccoon City disaster, the evidence that eventually reached the public through survivors and whistleblowers, precipitated a series of legal and governmental actions that ultimately resulted in Umbrella's collapse in 2003. One city's destruction brought down one of the most powerful and secretive corporations in the history of the game's world. Fact 74. Jill Valentine's blue tube top outfit from the original Resident Evil has become one of gaming's most recognizable character designs. Her choice of outfit for infiltrating a zombie-infested mansion in the mountains at night has been gently mocked for its impracticality for decades. The franchise itself eventually acknowledged this by introducing Jill in more practical combat attire in Resident Evil 3, a change that was narratively justified by the new game taking place during an active military crisis where she had time to prepare. The tube top has nonetheless been included as an unlockable costume in multiple subsequent releases because players genuinely love it. Fact 75. The Mercenaries mode, which first appeared as a bonus game within Resident Evil 3 and later became a beloved fixture of the franchise, began as a way of adding post-completion content to a game that was considered somewhat shorter than its predecessors. The mode challenged players to navigate areas from the main game within a time limit while killing as many enemies as possible to extend that limit. The time attack design created a completely different emotional experience from the main game's survival horror, replacing dread with adrenaline and rewarding aggression over caution. Mercenaries has appeared in nearly every mainline Resident Evil game since, and has developed its own devoted following, independent of the main campaigns. Section 5. The Man in the Sunglasses. Facts 76 through 95. Fact 76. Albert Wesker was born as the product of a eugenics program run by Oswell Spencer and has no birth family that he was ever aware of. In the 1960s, Spencer launched a classified program called Project W, named after the chief scientist leading it. The project identified children with exceptional genetics, born to parents of superior intellect, took them from their families, and raised them under controlled conditions designed to produce the perfect candidates for Spencer's vision of a superhuman ruling class. Every child in the program was given the surname Wesker, after the scientist running the project. Albert Wesker was designated test subject number 13. He never knew his biological parents. He never knew his real name. He grew up believing the life he had been constructed to live was simply his own. Fact 77. The Wesker Children Project was so classified that even Umbrella's other co-founders did not know it existed. Edward Ashford and James Marcus, who co-founded Umbrella alongside Spencer, were kept entirely in the dark about Project W throughout its existence. Spencer considered the program his personal creation, the insurance policy for his vision of the future, too important and too sensitive to share even with his closest collaborators. This level of secrecy meant that when Albert Wesker eventually learned the truth about his origins, he was discovering something that almost no one alive knew. The revelation, which he received from Spencer himself in Resident Evil 5, immediately preceded Spencer's death at Wesker's hands. Fact 78. Of the Wesker children who survived the initial screening and training process, only 2 individuals ultimately survived infection with the prototype virus derived from progenitor, Albert Wesker and Alex Wesker. All other candidates died during the infection process. Alex went on to become a researcher focused on the transfer of consciousness between bodies, foreshadowing in a disturbing way the thematic concerns that would become central to Resident Evil Village decades later in the franchise's timeline. Albert became the series' central antagonist. 2 survivors from a program that took dozens of children and turned them into instruments of Spencer's ambition. Fact 79. Albert Wesker was a genuinely gifted scientist whose intellectual contributions to T-virus research were significant. He was not simply a power-hungry villain who had stumbled into competence. His work on viral agents and bioorganic weapons at the Arklay laboratory was considered exceptional by Umbrella's internal standards, rivaling that of William Birkin, who was widely regarded as the company's most talented researcher. The relationship between Wesker and Birkin during their years at the Arklay laboratory was competitive but productive, a professional partnership between 2 extraordinarily gifted and morally unencumbered scientists. Fact 80. Wesker's iconic dark sunglasses were a deliberate character design choice meant to communicate emotional opacity. The lead voice actor hired for the character in the original game said in interviews that he wanted to give the character a precise, inhuman speech pattern, speaking in what he described as a military-type tone and deliberately never using contractions. The combination of the sunglasses, which concealed expressions and eye contact, and the flat, controlled vocal delivery created a character who seemed to process the world differently from everyone around him. His cold effect was a visible, audible manifestation of someone who had been designed since childhood to value intelligence over emotion. Fact 81. Albert Wesker was voiced by 4 different actors across his various English-language appearances. Pablo Kuntz voiced him in the original Resident Evil. Peter Jessup voiced him in the 2002 remake. Richard Waugh voiced him in Code Veronica, Resident Evil 0, and the original Resident Evil 4. D.C. Douglas became the most recognized voice for the character after taking over for the Umbrella Chronicles and continuing through Resident Evil 5. Each actor brought something slightly different to the role, with Douglas's performance in Resident Evil 5 becoming arguably the definitive portrayal, theatrical, contemptuous, and possessed of an operatic self-regard that matched the game's grand ambitions for the character's final confrontation. Fact 82. Wesker's eyes glow red. This is not simply a cosmetic design choice in the game's fiction. Within the lore, his eyes developed a form of periodic bioillumination as a side effect of the experimental virus he injected during the events of the original Resident Evil. The red glow intensifies when he experiences strong emotions, particularly anger. This detail creates a visible indicator of his internal state that contrasts with his otherwise controlled, unreadable presentation. He worked hard to appear emotionless. His eyes betrayed him. Fact 83. Wesker spent years undercover as a United States Army chemical engineer before returning to Umbrella. He used this position to access classified American biological weapons research and relay that information back to Umbrella, earning himself a promotion to executive status within the company. He was simultaneously serving as a spy for Umbrella inside the American military and a spy for the American government inside Umbrella, while also running his own agenda independently of both. The layers of his deception across the early part of his career are genuinely impressive as a feat of strategic patience. Fact 84. The virus that resurrected Wesker after his apparent death in the original Resident Evil gave him superhuman speed, strength, and regenerative capabilities. His reflexes became fast enough to catch a rocket-propelled grenade in mid-flight. This is demonstrated in Resident Evil 5, in a manner that the game clearly intends players to find genuinely startling. The same sequence also shows him hurling the grenade back at Chris and Sheva, with enough force to be lethal, communicating that his abilities were not just defensive, but offensively overwhelming. The developers of Resident Evil 5 have stated they wanted Wesker's combat capabilities to feel genuinely impossible to overcome without exploiting a specific weakness. Fact 85. Wesker's specific weakness in Resident Evil 5 was that the experimental P30 compound he had been using to maintain the stability of his viral infection required precise dosing. Too little, and the virus would destabilize. Too much would cause the virus to become uncontrollable, accelerating mutation to a degree that overwhelmed even his enhanced physiology. Chris and Shiva exploited this by exposing him to multiple doses of a serum derived from the progenitor virus, which overloaded his system. The volcanic setting of his final defeat, where he is thrown into active lava by Chris and Sheva and shot with rockets while submerged, was designed as a maximally dramatic end to the franchise's central villain. Fact 86. James Marcus, one of Umbrella's 3 original co-founders, was the director of the company's training facility and a primary researcher on the T-virus before being assassinated on Spencer's orders. Marcus had made significant progress in T-virus research using leeches as his primary experimental subjects. He was killed because Spencer feared he was becoming too powerful and too independent within the company. The assassination was carried out by the teenage Wesker and Birkin at Spencer's instruction, making them complicit in removing the man who had trained and mentored them. When the events of Resident Evil 0 are later revealed, it becomes clear that Marcus's leech-based research survived his death in a very literal sense. Fact 87. Spencer's original vision for Umbrella was explicitly eugenicist. He believed that humanity was fundamentally broken, self-destructive, and destined for catastrophe without intervention. His concept of solution involved using progenitor-derived viruses to trigger a mass extinction event that would kill the vast majority of humanity while leaving a small, virally enhanced ruling class to rebuild civilization according to his design. He would serve as the benevolent God Emperor of the resulting world. This was not a plan he kept secret from everyone. He wrote about it in personal documents. The documents were recovered by Wesker and used as evidence to expose Umbrella, which contributed to the corporation's legal and financial collapse. Fact 88. Wesker's son, Jake Muller, appears in Resident Evil 6 without knowing who his father was. Jake was born from a relationship Wesker had at some point, details that the franchise has never fully explored. His mother raised him to respect the memory of his father, without explaining who that father actually was. Jake spent much of his early life as a mercenary in Eastern Europe, eventually developing a reputation as an unusually skilled fighter. His genetic inheritance from Wesker gave him a natural resistance to viruses that made his blood the key to developing a vaccine for the C virus outbreak at the center of Resident Evil 6's story. The child of the franchise's greatest villain became the cure for one of its greatest disasters. Fact 89. The progenitor virus, which serves as the root organism from which virtually every bioweapon in the franchise was developed, was discovered growing in flowers in West Africa. A flower called the Stairway to the Sun was the source plant. Spencer learned of its existence through research channels and organized an expedition to Africa to obtain samples. The Ndipaya, an ancient tribe who had lived near the flowers for generations, had developed a complex relationship with the plant and understood its effects on humans without understanding the underlying biology. Spencer's acquisition of the progenitor virus in the late 1960s provided Umbrella with the raw material for everything that followed. Fact 90. Umbrella's public-facing pharmaceutical business was actually legitimate and produced genuinely useful products. Safsprin was an aspirin-based product. Adravil was a pain reliever. Aquacure was a wound treatment ointment. These products were not cover stories or hollow fronts. They generated real revenue, employed real scientists and workers in above-ground facilities, and maintained Umbrella's public reputation as a beneficial pharmaceutical corporation. The bioweapon research was conducted in classified underground facilities that were entirely separate from the company's visible operations. The people buying Safsprin at their local pharmacy had no way of knowing who made it. Fact 91. Umbrella's military arm, the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, was largely recruited from former Soviet military personnel and nationalist paramilitaries following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. This timing was deliberate. The dissolution of the USSR created a large pool of experienced military veterans who were no longer connected to a government paycheck, who had skills that were valuable in private military contexts, and who had fewer institutional loyalties that would prevent them from working for a secretive private corporation. Umbrella contracted these forces as a private army that operated in the gray zones between legitimate military action and corporate mercenary work. Fact 92. Albert Wesker had a sister, Alex Wesker, who was also a product of Project W. Alex was subject number 12, one number ahead of Albert, which in the context of the program made them closely matched in terms of genetic potential. Alex and Albert were natural competitors. Their rivalry pushed both of them to exceptional levels of achievement within Umbrella's research programs. Alex eventually stole research related to consciousness transfer, which she used in her own experiments documented in Resident Evil Revelations 2. Her work on moving awareness between bodies connects thematically with Mother Miranda's later research in Resident Evil Village, though the characters are unrelated. Fact 93. The collapse of Umbrella Corporation in 2003 did not end the bioterrorism threat. It scattered it. Umbrella's fall meant that bioweapon technology, research data, and actual biological agents were no longer secured behind a single corporate structure. Former researchers took their work elsewhere. Competing organizations acquired Umbrella's assets and technology through various legal and illegal channels. The post-Umbrella world was in some ways more dangerous than the Umbrella era because there was no longer even a nominally centralized corporate responsibility for the weapons that existed. This is why Chris Redfield and the BSAA continued to have work after Umbrella was gone. Fact 94. Wesker's sunglasses were briefly removed in a cutscene in Resident Evil 5, one of the very few times in the franchise that his eyes are visible without the red bioillumination effect. The moment was a creative choice by the development team to humanize him very slightly, to show that beneath the controlled presentation and the supernatural enhancements there was still a face, still something that had once been an ordinary child. It lasted only a few seconds before the film returned to his usual presentation. Fact 95. The Ouroboros virus, which Wesker planned to release into the global atmosphere in Resident Evil 5, was designed as the instrument of his vision for humanity's future. Ouroboros would infect the entire global population. The vast majority of people would die, consumed by the virus's mutative effects. A tiny minority whose genetics were compatible with the virus would survive and be enhanced, gaining the kind of superhuman capabilities Wesker himself possessed. Those survivors would form the foundation of a new human civilization under Wesker's guidance. The name Ouroboros refers to the ancient symbol of a snake eating its own tail, representing cyclical transformation. Wesker saw mass extinction as a necessary cleansing before a new beginning. Section 6. The 7-Year Nightmare. Facts 96 through 115. Fact 96. Resident Evil 4 spent approximately 7 years in active development before it shipped in January 2005. This was not 7 years of continuous productive work on a single vision. It was 4 distinct attempts to make a Resident Evil 4, 3 of which were abandoned at various stages of completion, followed by a 4th attempt that was essentially built from scratch and completed in roughly 18 months of intensely focused work. The fact that any game emerged from that process, let alone one of the most critically acclaimed games ever made, is genuinely remarkable. Fact 97. The first version of Resident Evil 4 was directed by Hideki Kamiya and was not really a Resident Evil game at all. Kamiya was developing a highly stylish, character action experience that emphasized fast, technically demanding combat, a completely different aesthetic from the survival horror the franchise had been built on. Shinji Mikami, who was serving as executive producer, looked at the game and decided it had strayed too far from the Resident Evil formula to work as a mainline sequel. Rather than discard what was there, Capcom made the remarkably pragmatic decision to retitle the project entirely and let Kamiya develop his vision as a new intellectual property. That game became Devil May Cry, the franchise that produced multiple generations of technically demanding action games with gothic aesthetics was born from a Resident Evil 4 that got too stylish. Fact 98. The second version of Resident Evil 4, known among fans as the Castle version, was developed from 2001 to 2002 and featured Leon S. Kennedy invading the castle headquarters of Oswell Spencer and the Umbrella Corporation. This version had a much more direct connection to the franchise's established lore. The story was intended as a proper sequel to Code Veronica that would finally show the confrontation between the government, the military, and Umbrella directly. Leon would have been infected with a retrovirus early in the game and slowly mutated over the course of the story, which would have been a fascinating development for the character. The castle itself was based on extensive photographic research of real castles across Spain, England, and Wales. Fact 99. One element from the castle version was a planned scenario where Leon's left arm would become infected and begin mutating. To slow the infection's spread, Leon would wrap a belt tightly around his arm. This detail, a hero physically struggling to contain the virus inside his own body while fighting through a hostile environment, is genuinely compelling. It was cut when the castle version was abandoned, but the visual image of a mutating left arm attached to Leon somehow survived in various forms. When the Hookman version was shown at E3 2003, the promotional material hinted at Leon gaining powers in an infected hand, and fans have long noted the thematic parallel to Ethan Winters losing and reattaching his hand in Resident Evil 7, though that connection is almost certainly coincidental. Fact 100. The third version of Resident Evil 4, known as the Hookman version, was shown publicly at E3 2003 and generated enormous excitement. This was the version that blended Resident Evil's familiar fixed camera angles with a new over-the-shoulder perspective, included supernatural elements, and featured a villain called the Hookman, whose appearance was unlike anything in the franchise. The Hookman version was set in an atmospheric Gothic castle shrouded in fog. The E3 demonstration showed Leon being stalked through flickering candlelit corridors by a figure that seemed to partially exist outside physical reality. It is one of the most discussed pieces of never-released game footage in history because it looked genuinely extraordinary. Fact 101. The Hookman version was also ultimately abandoned. Mikami, now directing the project himself after taking over from Shibata, decided that the supernatural elements did not fit what Resident Evil should be. The series had always grounded its horror in biological science, in viruses and parasites and corporate negligence. Introducing genuinely supernatural phenomena would change the franchise's fundamental nature in a way he was unwilling to accept. The atmospheric fog, the castle setting, the pursuit-based tension, all of these elements were preserved and refined. The Hookman himself and the supernatural underpinnings were removed entirely. Fact 102. Mikami was warned by Capcom that if Resident Evil 4 did not sell well, the company would not produce any further Resident Evil titles. The pressure this created was significant. The development team knew they were working on a game that, if it failed, would end the franchise. Some team members became so discouraged by the repeated failed attempts that they left the project. The staff who remained had to be managed through periods of genuine demoralization. Mikami has spoken about how difficult it was to keep the team's energy focused and creative when so much of what they built kept getting thrown away. Fact 103. Shinji Mikami publicly stated that he would cut his own head off if Resident Evil 4 was ported to PlayStation 2 after its release as a GameCube exclusive. He was extremely vocal about his commitment to the platform exclusivity deal Capcom had made with Nintendo. He considered the exclusive release artistically and commercially important. Capcom announced a PlayStation 2 port approximately 6 months after the GameCube release. The port happened. Mikami's head remained attached to his body. He left Capcom shortly afterward, going on to found Tango Gameworks and direct The Evil Within, among other projects. Fact 104. The over-the-shoulder camera perspective that Resident Evil 4 introduced and that transformed the third-person shooter genre was not planned as the game's defining innovation. It emerged organically from the process of trying to make combat feel right. When the camera shifted to over-the-shoulder, the combat system suddenly worked in a way it had not before. Enemies became more threatening at a different distance. The player's relationship to space changed in a way that made every room feel simultaneously more manageable and more dangerous. The developers followed that instinct and built the final version of the game around what that camera perspective made possible. Fact 105. Las Plagas, the parasite that serves as the central biological element of Resident Evil 4, was designed as a deliberate counterpoint to the T-virus. Where the T-virus attacked brain function and reduced hosts to mindless, aggressive movement, Las Plagas took over the brain while leaving cognitive function partially intact. Ganados, the infected Spanish villagers in Resident Evil 4, could communicate with each other, coordinate attacks, use tools, and respond to commands from their controllers. They were not zombies in the traditional sense. They were human beings whose autonomy had been overridden by a parasitic organism that could direct their behavior while leaving them functionally capable of complex tasks. This created a different kind of horror. Enemies who seemed almost human until they did something that reminded you they were not. Fact 106. Leon S. Kennedy's characterization in Resident Evil 4 was a significant departure from his appearance in Resident Evil 2. In Resident Evil 2, Leon was a young rookie cop on his first day at work, who spent the night surviving an experience that broke something fundamental in his worldview. By Resident Evil 4, 6 years had passed. He had become a government agent. The wide-eyed, somewhat overwhelmed young man had been replaced by someone cooler, more competent, and more comfortable with danger. The game's writers also gave him a wry sense of humor, a series of one-liners and observations that contrasted deliberately with the grimness of his situation. This characterization proved enormously popular and became the template for Leon in every subsequent appearance. Fact 107. Ashley Graham, the president's daughter, Leon rescues in Resident Evil 4, was designed as a character who would test players' patience. She cannot fight. She needs to be escorted through dangerous environments. She screams when grabbed by enemies. She can be accidentally shot by the player. Every one of these design elements was deliberate. Escort missions had a reputation in gaming as frustrating, annoying obligations, and Resident Evil 4 committed to the concept fully while trying to make Ashley herself feel like a real person worth protecting, rather than simply an obstacle. Whether they succeeded is a matter of genuine disagreement among players. Fact 108. The merchant in Resident Evil 4, the mysterious figure who appears at inexplicable locations throughout the game selling weapons and upgrades, has no explained origin in the game's fiction. He is simply there when you need him, cheerfully conducting business in a Spanish village that is actively trying to kill you. His catchphrase, "What are you buying?" and "What are you selling?" became instantly recognizable parts of the franchise's cultural vocabulary. In Resident Evil Village, the Duke character directly references him as an old friend, implying a connection between the two figures that has never been explicitly explored. Fact 109. The Separate Ways campaign, which tells the story of Ada Wong's involvement in the events of Resident Evil 4 from her perspective, was created exclusively for the PlayStation 2 port and was not in the original GameCube version of the game. It was one of several additions made specifically to incentivize players who had already experienced the main game to purchase the PS2 version. The campaign revealed that Ada was working for Wesker during the events of the game, that she deliberately provided Wesker with a lesser form of the Las Plagas sample rather than the dominant specimen he requested, and that her complex personal feelings about Leon influenced decisions she made during the mission. It retroactively changed the interpretation of her behavior throughout the main game. Fact 110. The island chapter at the end of Resident Evil 4, where Leon reaches a military base and confronts Las Plagas-infected soldiers rather than villagers, was a late addition to the development process. The original game was meant to end after the castle. Mikami felt the game needed a final escalation that matched the pace of what came before. The island chapter, despite being criticized by some players as a tonal shift, was meant to show the full military and institutional scale behind the Los Illuminados cult's power. Fact 111. Salazar, the diminutive nobleman who serves as a mid-game antagonist in Resident Evil 4, was designed partly as a comic antagonist whose dramatic self-presentation contrasted humorously with his actual ineffectiveness. He commands enormous resources, summons gigantic bioweapons, and delivers theatrical speeches, and yet Leon defeats him without significant difficulty. The humor was intentional. The game's writers wanted to acknowledge that the world of Resident Evil had always contained a degree of B-movie camp alongside its genuine horror, and Salazar was a way of leaning into that openly. Fact 112. Resident Evil 4's Plagas parasite was partially retconned in the 2020 Resident Evil 3 remake to be connected to the Nemesis T-type's NE alpha parasite. Both were presented as European origin organisms with mind control properties. The writers of the ERE3 remake used this connection to tie the European branch of Umbrella's research to the Las Plagas cult's origins, though they were careful not to explain too much and maintain the ambiguity that makes the Las Plagas organism feel ancient and separate from Umbrella's more recent work. Fact 113. Krauser, Leon's former military partner, who appears in Resident Evil 4 as an antagonist, was created specifically for the game's story. His background as Leon's former comrade and his transformation into a servant of Wesker was meant to illustrate what became of soldiers who made contact with the bioweapon world through institutional channels. He was skilled, ruthless, and had lost whatever moral anchors had once existed when his injuries removed him from legitimate military service. His knife duel with Leon remains one of the series' most memorable boss encounters. Fact 114. The Resident Evil 4 remake, released in 2023, brought in original game director Mikami as a creative consultant and made a series of substantial narrative and design changes while preserving the overall structure and key moments of the original. Ashley was given a more assertive personality. Ada Wong's storyline was revised to make her motivations clearer. The village, castle, and island sections were all rebuilt with expanded detail. The Separate Ways DLC for the remake was an entirely new version of Ada's campaign that went significantly further in exploring her relationship with Wesker and Leon than the original did. Fact 115. The Resident Evil 4 VR version, released for MetaQuest headsets in 2021, made the significant design decision of removing certain flirtatious dialogue exchanges between Leon and Ashley and between Leon and Ada. The development team felt that in a virtual reality context, where the player is physically inhabiting the game's space rather than watching it through a screen, certain kinds of interactions changed character in ways that felt inappropriate. The removals generated discussion about how the medium of virtual reality changes the relationship between player and content in ways that are still being understood. Section 7. Back to Fear. Facts 116 through 135. Fact 116. Resident Evil 7. Biohazard began development just 6 months after Resident Evil 7's predecessor, Resident Evil Village, was itself shipped. Correction: development on what would become Resident Evil 7 began approximately 6 months after Resident Evil 6 shipped. Resident Evil 6, released in October 2012, was the most action-oriented mainline entry in the franchise's history. It contained multiple campaigns, an enormous scale, and was described by critics and fans as the point at which the franchise had completely lost its identity as a horror series. The creative team at Capcom heard that feedback clearly. The first internal pitch for the next game was built around a single question: how do you return to horror? Fact 117. The initial code name for what became Resident Evil 7 was Kitchen. This was also the name of the first public demonstration of the game, shown at E3 2015 as a PlayStation 5R tech demo. Visitors to the Sony booth put on headsets and found themselves inside a dark house, seated at a table, with something moving in the shadows nearby. The demo was deliberately minimal. It showed almost nothing of what the final game would be. What it communicated was an atmosphere of confinement and dread that the franchise had not produced in years. The reaction was significant enough to confirm the direction the team was pursuing. Fact 118. Resident Evil 7's creative team looked to The Evil Dead, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the Saw film series as primary inspirations for the game's setting and tone. Producer Jun Takeuchi cited The Evil Dead specifically for its compact, intimate approach to horror, the single location, the small cast of characters, the sense that no one outside the situation knew or cared what was happening inside. That intimacy was seen as the key to recovering what had been lost in the franchise's action-heavy years. Horror works best when it is personal, when the threat is immediate and inescapable, and the world outside is unreachable. Fact 119. The Baker family went through numerous concept art iterations during development. Producer Jun Takeuchi made the decision to delay script writing and give the character design team more freedom before the story was locked, which resulted in significantly more exploration of who the Bakers could be visually. Numerous sketches were produced searching for what Takeuchi described as the image of a terrifying family. The Bakers originally had a pet dog named Diane who was planned to appear at the dinner table cutscene, sitting alongside the family while they attempted to force Ethan to eat with them. The dog was cut from the final game. The dinner table sequence, which became one of the most discussed scenes in the franchise's history, occurs without the dog. Fact 120. Jack Baker's character and some of his specific mannerisms were inspired by Jack Torrance from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, portrayed by Jack Nicholson. The naming was not coincidental. Writer Morimasa Sato has stated that Jack Torrance was a conscious reference point for how Jack Baker should behave. A man who had once been a normal person, possibly even a good one, who had been transformed by circumstances beyond his control into something monstrous while retaining traces of his former self beneath the surface. The moments in the game where glimpses of the pre-infected Jack Baker emerge, his military history, the way he talks about his family, were deliberately included to make the horror of what Evelyn had done to him feel like a genuine tragedy. Fact 121. Marguerite Baker's power to control insects was designed specifically to create a different kind of body horror from her husband's overwhelming physical strength. Jack Baker was a force of direct confrontation. Marguerite was something stranger, a woman whose body had become a habitat, a creature who weaponized the disgust response in a more sustained and intimate way. The moment in the game where players discover the full extent of what has happened to her body in the greenhouse section is one of the game's most disturbing revelations. Fact 122. Lucas Baker, the Baker family's son, was designed as a villain who remained villainous independently of Evelyn's influence. His behavior before the Evelyn infection hinted at pre-existing antisocial tendencies and possible sadistic behavior. When Evelyn infected the Baker family and granted them mold-based powers, Lucas used those powers to pursue his own interests in isolation from his family's dynamic. He was secretly still in contact with the Connections, the bioterrorism organization that had created Eveline, providing them with research data in exchange for a serum that partially suppressed the mold's control over him. He was complicit in his own infection's consequences in a way his parents and sister were not. Fact 123. Zoe Baker, the only family member who remained mentally coherent and morally intact throughout the game's events, was retained as the only clear ethical center within the Baker household. Her survival of the infection without losing her autonomy is unexplained within the game's fiction, but appears to be related to her biological compatibility with the mold, which was low enough to prevent full control, but high enough that she could not escape the infection entirely. Her fate in the main game depends on a player choice, and her continuation in the End of Zoe DLC ends with her being cured through the direct intervention of her Uncle Joe. Fact 124. The RE engine, which powered Resident Evil 7 and has been used for every major Capcom release since, was built specifically for Resident Evil 7's development. The engine was designed around first-person perspective, photorealistic rendering, and the kind of close-quarters horror environment the game was built around. Its success was significant enough that Capcom adopted it as their primary development engine across multiple franchises, including Devil May Cry 5, Monster Hunter World expansions, and the Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 remakes. Fact 125. Resident Evil 7 sold approximately 15.4 million copies as of mid-2025, making it the second best-selling entry in the franchise behind the 2019 Resident Evil 2 remake. This was far beyond what Capcom had initially projected for the game. The combination of the VR support, which made it one of the highest-profile uses of PlayStation VR technology at the time, with a genuine return to horror atmosphere that the fanbase had been asking for, produced a commercial result that exceeded internal expectations significantly. Fact 126. Evelyn, the bioweapon at the center of Resident Evil 7's story, was engineered to produce mold capable of mind control, and then designed to look like a 10-year-old child, to make her easier to deploy covertly and harder for enemies to identify as a threat. The organization that created her, the Connections, then subjected her to chemical treatments to suppress her emotional responses and keep her controllable. The horror of her character is that she was given everything necessary for human feeling, intelligence, attachment, the need for family and love, and then systematically denied any of it. Her violence was not malice. It was longing expressed through the only mechanism she had available. Fact 127. The Baker estate is located in the fictional parish of Dulvey, Louisiana. The state of Louisiana was chosen as the setting because it offered the creative team a specific kind of American Gothic aesthetic that felt distinct from every previous Resident Evil setting. The bayou, the subtropical decay, the Spanish moss hanging from the trees, the antebellum plantation architecture slowly being consumed by the swamp. These visual elements created a horror atmosphere that felt specific and grounded in a real American tradition of the uncanny South. The game's production designers traveled to Louisiana to conduct location research and photograph real plantations, swamps, and rural properties. Fact 128. The Daughters DLC for Resident Evil 7 shows the Baker family on the night Eveline first arrived at their property, telling the story of the infection's beginning from inside the family. Zoe is the player character, and the events shown include the moment when Jack and Marguerite Baker first make contact with Eveline and are infected, the gradual transformation from a concerned family sheltering a sick child to the monstrousness that Ethan would encounter 3 years later. The DLC is remarkable for showing the Bakers at their most human, their love for each other, their instinct to help someone in need, their utter lack of understanding of what was happening to them as the mold took hold. Fact 129. The BSAA, the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, was founded as a direct response to the collapse of Umbrella and the dispersal of bioweapon technology that followed. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine were founding members of the organization, along with several other individuals with field experience in containing biological threats. The BSAA was initially funded and endorsed by the major global pharmaceutical companies and governments, which created its own set of conflicts of interest and compromises that the franchise explores across multiple games. By the time of Resident Evil Village, the organization has itself been compromised, using bows as soldiers, which Chris discovers and begins investigating. Fact 130. Resident Evil 7's development team was specifically instructed not to look at PT, the canceled Silent Hills demo, from Konami that had been released in 2014 and generated enormous attention for its first-person horror approach. Capcom acknowledged that comparisons would inevitably be made between Resident Evil 7 and PT, since both used first-person perspective in horror environments with narrow spaces. They were insistent that Resident Evil 7 was in development long before the reveal of PT, and that no staff from PT's development had been involved in creating RE7. The first-person perspective had been an aspiration for the franchise since 1993. Fact 131. Joe Baker, the protagonist of the End of Zoe DLC, is one of the most mechanically distinctive characters in the franchise's history. He fights primarily with his bare hands. He acquires an Umbrella-developed power gauntlet during the DLC that amplifies his punching force enough to destroy the molded creatures that overrun the Baker estate. The DLC's tone was deliberately lighter than the main game, closer to action comedy than horror, with Joe as an archetypal tough old man character fighting through a nightmare with nothing but his fists and his stubbornness. The contrast with the terrified, weaponless Ethan of the main game was deliberate. Fact 132. The mold in Resident Evil 7 is connected to the Megamycete, the ancient fungal organism beneath the Romanian mountains that is central to Resident Evil Village. Evelyn was created using samples derived from the Megamycete. The connections obtained those samples from Miranda. This means that Evelyn's infection of the Baker family, Ethan's death and resurrection, Mia's infection, and Rose's unique biological composition all trace back to Miranda's cave laboratory in Eastern Europe. The horror that destroyed one American family in Louisiana had its roots in a grieving mother's experiment a century earlier and a continent away. Fact 133. The character of Mia Winters carries a significant amount of moral complexity that the game does not fully foreground. She was an agent of the Connections, an employee of the bioterrorism organization that created Evelyn. Her job was to act as Evelyn's handler during transport. She knew what Evelyn was. She knew the organization she worked for was using a bioweapon designed to look like a child. She participated in that system for financial reasons. And when things went wrong on the transport vessel, the consequences fell on people who had no connection to the organization at all. The Baker family's suffering was in some measure a consequence of choices Mia made for money before she met Ethan. Fact 134. Resident Evil 7's soundtrack was composed primarily by Akiyuki Morimoto, Miwako Chinone, and Brian D'Oliveira. The musical approach was deliberately sparse and textural rather than melodically prominent. The score used ambient industrial sounds, distorted strings, and environmental noise to create unease without announcing itself as horror music in the traditional sense. Silence was used extensively throughout the game as a compositional choice, with the absence of sound functioning as its own source of tension. Fact 135. The note from Mia mechanic at the start of Resident Evil 7, where Ethan receives a video message from his wife who has been missing for 3 years, was designed as the most stripped-back possible motivation for a horror game protagonist. The team wanted a reason for the player to be somewhere dangerous that required no prior knowledge of the franchise, no complex backstory, and no sophisticated emotional setup. A man got a message from his wife. She needed help. He went. Everything else followed from that. It was one of the most effective pieces of character economy in the franchise's history. Section 8. The Village and Its Secrets, Facts 136 through 155. Fact 136. Development on Resident Evil Village began approximately 6 months after Resident Evil 7 shipped, which was before the team even fully understood how the public would receive that game. The decision to continue Ethan Winters' story was made almost immediately. The creative team had grown attached to the character and felt that his story had room to develop in ways the first game had only hinted at. The early pitch for Village was described internally as a gothic horror approach, expanding the scale dramatically from a single Louisiana estate to an entire European village with multiple distinct environments and a cast of antagonists with their own aesthetics and backstories. Fact 137. An early concept for Village involved the story being split between two time periods: a modern-day story set in the village and a parallel story set in medieval times, during which players would experience the Megamycetes effects on an ancient population. This dual timeline approach was ultimately abandoned, but the medieval storyline concept informed the design of the village's architecture and its inhabitants' relationship with the ancient infection that had shaped their history for centuries. Fact 138. Lady Alcina Dimitrescu's extraordinary height of 9 feet and 6 inches made her an immediate cultural phenomenon when she was first revealed in promotional materials. The internet's reaction to the character, a combination of genuine fear, aesthetic admiration, and somewhat chaotic enthusiasm, was one of the most discussed video game fandom responses in recent memory. The development team was reportedly surprised by the intensity of the response. Capcom's marketing, rather than backing away from it, leaned into it deliberately, using Lady Dimitrescu as the primary face of the game's promotional campaign. Fact 139. Lady Dimitrescu's continuous height increase was a result of the Kadu parasite amplifying her pre-existing hereditary blood disease into a mutation that triggered continuous growth hormone production. She did not start at 9 feet and 6 inches. She grew to that height over years of infection. The growth was gradual enough that the transformation was processed socially within the village's cult framework as evidence of Mother Miranda's blessing, rather than recognized as a medical symptom of a worsening condition. Fact 140. The 3 Dimitrescu daughters, Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela, were not Alcina's biological children. They were created by Miranda using a process that combined Kadu parasites with insect DNA during the reanimation of corpses. The result was 3 beings who could disperse their bodies into swarms of flies, with each individual fly carrying a fragment of a distributed consciousness connected through the Megamycete network. Each daughter had a distinct personality and individual preferences despite sharing this unusual biology, which required the writing team to develop 3 separately credible characters from what was essentially an unprecedented biological concept. Fact 141. Heisenberg's factory, the 4th major location in Resident Evil Village, was designed as a visual representation of industrial horror that contrasted deliberately with the Baroque organic horror of Castle Dimitrescu, the intimate domestic horror of House Beneviento, and the aquatic grotesquerie of the Reservoir. Each lord's domain was meant to have a visually distinctive horror identity that reflected its ruler's personality and the nature of their mutation. Heisenberg's facility was metal, mechanism, and motion, a space defined by what could be manufactured and weaponized. Fact 142. Donna Beneviento's challenge sequence, in which Ethan is forced to navigate her mansion while experiencing hallucinations induced by her pollen, contains one of the most disturbing sequences in the franchise's history. The sequence, which players frequently describe as the most frightening part of the game, takes place almost entirely without weapons and involves Ethan being chased through a dimly lit environment by something that should not exist. The sequence was designed to be completely unlike any other part of the game, and to demonstrate that horror could still work on a primal level even after players had spent hours dealing with monsters they could shoot. Fact 143. Salvatore Moreau's design as an amphibious, fish-like mutant living in a flooded reservoir was inspired by maritime folklore about sea monsters and mermen. The creative team wanted each lord to reflect a different tradition of European monster mythology. Dimitrescu drew from vampire lore. The Lycaonians drew from werewolf mythology. Moreau drew from the deep-water horror of something that was once human but had been adapted to a different environment in deeply wrong ways. Fact 144. The character of Karl Heisenberg was designed as the most intellectually self-aware figure in the game's central cast of antagonists. Unlike the other lords, who had varying degrees of buy-in to Miranda's cult mythology, Heisenberg understood exactly what Miranda was, what she had done to him, and what she planned to do next. His attempt to recruit Ethan into a rebellion against Miranda was not villainy for its own sake, but rather a strategically rational attempt to survive a situation he correctly identified as terminal. He was still responsible for atrocities, but his clarity about his circumstances distinguishes him from characters who are operating within delusions. Fact 145. The Duke, the mysterious merchant character in Resident Evil Village, is directly connected to the merchant from Resident Evil 4 through dialogue. When Ethan asks what the Duke actually is, the Duke admits he genuinely does not know. When he later uses the phrase, "What are you buying?" he catches himself and attributes it to an old friend. The implication is that the two merchants knew each other personally, suggesting they may be the same type of entity or connected in ways the franchise has not yet explained. Both figures appear in isolated communities dealing with parasitic outbreaks. Both are immune to the violence around them. Both have knowledge of the protagonist's situation that they should not possess. Fact 146. Mother Miranda was infected with the megamycete in 1919 following the death of her daughter Eva from the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu pandemic that Miranda experienced was historically real, killing somewhere between 50 and 100 million people globally between 1918 and 1920. Miranda's personal tragedy was not fictional in its context. Tens of millions of parents lost children to that pandemic. Her response to that loss, the century of experiments, the cult, the bioweapon disasters that eventually reached Louisiana, was extreme in degree but not unusual in its emotional origin. Fact 147. Resident Evil Village's development team was influenced by folk horror films, including The Wicker Man, and various Eastern European horror traditions that dealt with rural communities built around sacrifice and secrecy. The village as a setting, cut off from the modern world by geography and by decades of deliberate isolation enforced by Miranda's cult, drew from these traditions of communities that had made ancient and terrible bargains and continued to maintain them regardless of the cost. Fact 148. Rosemary Winters, the infant at the center of Resident Evil Village's plot, was not given a name in the initial story outline. The team developed her identity and significance as the writing and design work progressed. Her name, Rose, was chosen partly for its simplicity and partly for the contrast it offered with the gothic complexity of everything surrounding her. A baby named Rose in a castle full of mold and monsters and ancient evil. The simplicity was the point. Fact 149. The Shadows of Rose DLC, set 16 years after the events of Village, presents Rosemary Winters as a teenager dealing with the mold-based abilities she has inherited from her unique biology. The DLC explores the megamycete's inner landscape as a psychological and spiritual space, with Rose encountering a fragment of Ethan's consciousness preserved within the fungal network. The DLC directly engages with the possibility that Ethan, despite his physical death, exists in some form within the megamycete, leaving open questions about resurrection, identity, and the nature of consciousness that Village had spent its entire runtime examining. Fact 150. The Beneviento house sequence in Village is the only major section of the game that takes place entirely without combat. Players enter Donna Beneviento's mansion, explore it with no weapons equipped, and must navigate the hallucination sequence without any ability to fight back. This was a deliberate design choice to create a specific kind of vulnerability that the rest of the game, which provides players with an extensive arsenal, does not replicate. The developers wanted players to feel genuinely helpless in a way that the game's gunplay normally prevents. Fact 151. The megamycete, the ancient fungal organism beneath the mountains of Resident Evil Village, is implied through Miranda's research notes and the broader lore to have been interacting with human populations in the region for millennia. Increased mold activity is documented in Miranda's notes from as early as the 15th century, with individuals showing signs of infection described as monsters by communities that had no biological framework for what they were observing. The megamycete's history predates not just Umbrella, but the entire modern concept of the virus as a medical reality. Fact 152. Chris Redfield in Resident Evil Village shoots who appears to be Mia Winters at the beginning of the game, as part of an operation to extract Ethan and Rose from a situation he knows has been compromised. The actual Mia had been replaced by Miranda using shape-shifting abilities derived from her extensive mold infection. Miranda had been impersonating Mia for an unspecified period before Chris's team arrived. Chris's decision to shoot her was based on intelligence suggesting that Mia had been compromised or replaced. He was right, though the presentation of the scene is designed to make players believe he has done something terrible. Fact 153. The Village game was balanced to be less frightening than Resident Evil 7, following feedback that Resident Evil 7 was sometimes too scary for a significant portion of its audience. Producer Tsuyoshi Kanda acknowledged in interviews that the team had received input suggesting that some players found Resident Evil 7's horror too intense to continue playing through. Village was designed to maintain horror as a consistent presence while allowing players to feel more capable and empowered than Ethan had been in the Baker estate. Fact 154. Ethan Winters' hands are injured extensively throughout both his games. His left hand is severed and reattached in Resident Evil 7. His fingers are bitten off. His right hand is severely damaged in Village. The persistent targeting of Ethan's hands was a deliberate design choice by the creative team to give a first-person protagonist a recognizable physical presence. In a first-person game, the player's hands are their primary point of contact with the world. Making those hands visibly, repeatedly damaged was a way of communicating Ethan's vulnerability and the physical cost of everything he was enduring. Fact 155. Resident Evil Village sold over 12 million copies as of 2025, making it one of the fastest-selling entries in the franchise's history. The combination of Lady Dimitrescu's cultural impact, the continuation of Ethan's story from Resident Evil 7, and the game's status as a launch window title for PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X contributed to unusually strong sales across multiple platforms and demographics. Section 9, Records, Oddities, and Hidden Details. Facts 156 through 175. Fact 156. The Resident Evil 2's remake, released in January 2019, outsold the original 1998 Resident Evil 2 within a year of its release. The original game had sold approximately 5 million copies during its commercial life across all platforms. The remake sold over 5 million copies within its first year and continued climbing, eventually reaching over 15 million copies sold by mid-2025. A game that took 67 days to develop its original predecessor, the Resident Evil 1.5 that was thrown away, and roughly 21 months to produce in its final form, was commercially surpassed by its own reimagining in the first 12 months. Fact 157. The 2019 Resident Evil 2 Remake's version of Mr. X became an internet meme of significant scale. The character's combination of his incongruously gentlemanly appearance, the trench coat and newly added fedora hat, and his methodical, implacable pursuit of the player through the police station created a figure that the internet found simultaneously terrifying and deeply funny. He was frequently depicted walking impassively through chaos, and the song X Gone Give It To Ya by DMX was edited into videos of him stalking through Raccoon City police station corridors. The development team was reportedly surprised by the character's popularity, given that he had been present in a much more limited form in the original 1998 game. Fact 158. A Game Boy Color version of the original Resident Evil was developed and actually reached a late stage of production before being canceled in 2000. The port was developed by HotGen, a British development studio. The Game Boy Color was a severely limited platform with a tiny screen, limited processing power, and no backlight. Getting Resident Evil to run on it at all was a significant technical challenge. The port was canceled due to quality concerns. The finished product simply did not reach a standard Capcom considered acceptable. A prototype version of the canceled port has circulated in collector communities for years and gives a sense of what the Game Boy version would have been. Fact 159. Resident Evil Code. Veronica was originally intended to be the numbered third mainline entry in the franchise. It was developed for the Sega Dreamcast rather than a Sony platform, which is part of why it ended up without a number. Its story was designed as a direct continuation of Claire Redfield's narrative from Resident Evil 2 and introduced significant new lore about the Ashford family and Umbrella's history. Many fans consider it the true third mainline entry, regardless of its title, and it remains the only significant Resident Evil game from that era that has not yet received a modern remake or remaster, a situation the fan base has opinions about. Fact 160. The Resident Evil anime films, produced as CGI animated features, exist in a separate continuity from both the main game series and the Paul W. S. Anderson live-action films. Degeneration, Damnation, and Vendetta each told standalone stories featuring Leon Kennedy and other franchise characters, with Damnation being particularly notable for its depiction of Leon operating as a rogue agent in an Eastern European civil conflict. The films received mixed critical reception but strong responses from the game franchise's fan base, who appreciated seeing game-accurate character designs in motion. Fact 161. The Resident Evil franchise has a canonically consistent answer to the question of what happened to Raccoon City after its destruction. The city's destruction was covered up by the United States government as an industrial accident. Survivors who attempted to speak publicly about what they had seen were discredited or disappeared. The government's ability to maintain this cover story was compromised when evidence obtained by Wesker was released, leading eventually to Umbrella's prosecution and collapse. The story of how the truth about Raccoon City eventually became public within the game's fiction unfolds across multiple games and supplementary materials. Fact 162. There is a fictional medicine called Safsprin that appears on posters throughout the original Resident Evil and several subsequent games. It is an Umbrella-branded aspirin product. Its fictional slogan is, "The Common Cure." The presence of these ordinary pharmaceutical advertisements throughout a game about biological catastrophe created by the same company serves as a recurring visual commentary. The mundane and the monstrous operating under the same brand name, the everyday cure and the weapon of mass destruction being products of the same corporation. Fact 163. The voice acting for the original Resident Evil has been preserved and included as an option in multiple remasters and re-releases. The original voice acting, the performances recorded by amateur actors in Japan under two-take conditions, remains selectable in several current platform versions of the game. Players who want to hear Barry Burton describe Jill as the master of unlocking still have that option, 30 years after it was recorded. Some fans consider the original voice work inseparable from the experience of the first game and will play no other version. Fact 164. Raccoon City's skyline in the 2019 Resident Evil 2 remake was specifically modeled on Montreal, Quebec, in central Canada. The choice of Montreal was made for aesthetic reasons, its mix of French-influenced architecture and North American urban density, creating a skyline that felt both familiar and slightly unusual, a city that exists and does not exist simultaneously. The film crew for the Paul W. S. Anderson Resident Evil movies also chose Toronto, another Canadian city, as their primary filming location for Raccoon City, though those films are not canonical to the game series. Fact 165. The Resident Evil franchise's 30th anniversary occurred in 2026, and Capcom acknowledged it with the release of Resident Evil Requiem, the 9th mainline entry. The game returned Leon Kennedy to Raccoon City decades after the original disaster, and was built on the ERE engine. The first game launched on March 22, 1996. 3 decades of survival horror, multiple hardware generations, creative reinventions that saved the franchise at least twice, and over 170 million copies sold. The franchise that started with amateur actors, a pop star's songs, and a team of inexperienced developers making their first PlayStation game survived all of it. Fact 166. Resident Evil 5's sales numbers make it technically the best-selling individual entry in the franchise, having sold approximately 13 million copies on its original platforms. This is notable because Resident Evil 5 is one of the most debated games in the franchise's history, criticized for prioritizing action over horror and for specific design choices that have generated ongoing discussion. Its commercial success, despite the critical conversation around it, speaks to both the franchise's brand strength and to the appeal of Resident Evil 5's particular vision of action horror cooperative gameplay. Fact 167. The Plaga organism in Resident Evil 4 operates on a reproductive cycle that the game's lore documents in detail. Dominant species Plaga are capable of producing new parasites, while subordinate species cannot reproduce independently. This biological distinction was central to Wesker's plan. He specifically needed a dominant species, Plaga, to conduct his own research into mind control applications. Ada Wong's decision to give him a subordinate species sample, rather than the dominant specimen he requested, was a deliberate act of sabotage that delayed his program significantly. Fact 168. The progenitor virus, discovered in African flowers by Spencer's expedition in the late 1960s, is theorized within the game's lore to predate humanity. The Indapaya tribe that had lived near the stairway to the sunflowers for generations had oral histories describing the plant's effects on humans going back further than their recorded memory extended. Spencer's scientists found physical evidence of the virus in biological samples thousands of years old. The possibility that the most dangerous organism in the Resident Evil universe evolved before Homo sapiens existed is not directly addressed by the games, but lingers as an implication. Fact 169. Barry Burton, Jill's ally in the original Resident Evil, who famously presented her with a lockpick and described her as the master of unlocking, has a canonical explanation for his behavior in the original game. He was being blackmailed by Wesker, who had threatened the lives of his wife and daughters if Barry did not cooperate with Umbrella's agenda during the Spencer Mansion mission. Several of Barry's more suspicious actions in the original game, including providing Wesker with information and occasionally helping the player in ways that could be interpreted as half-hearted sabotage, were retconned in the remake and supplementary materials as the actions of a man trying to protect his family, while also trying to protect his colleague without being able to tell her why. Fact 170. The development team for Resident Evil 4 used extensive photographic reference of real Spanish and Welsh castles when designing Salazar Castle. The team gathered hundreds of photographs of European castle architecture during pre-production and used them as reference for every major architectural element in the game. This research investment is one reason the castle in Resident Evil 4 feels structurally believable despite its labyrinthine complexity. The grandeur is grounded in real architectural traditions. Fact 171. The Umbrella Corporation logo, the distinctive red and white parasol design, was chosen to communicate the company's pharmaceutical identity to the public. Within the game's fiction, the logo was adopted as a symbol of protection, a company that sheltered the world from illness. The irony of a company that created viral weapons of mass destruction using a protective umbrella as its public symbol was intentional on Spencer's part. His contempt for the public he was exploiting was expressed partly through this kind of deliberate private joke embedded in the brand identity. Fact 172. Leon Kennedy's hair in Resident Evil 2 is described in detail in official Capcom character documentation. His specific style, the side-parted design with the longer swept portion, was referenced as part of his character Bible for the original game, and has remained a consistent element of his design across every subsequent appearance. Character designers working on remakes, sequels, and licensed merchandise have access to these specifications to ensure continuity. Leon's hair is canonical. Fact 173. The Resident Evil franchise has been adapted into novels, comics, an audio drama series, collectible card games, board games, pachinko machines, and multiple feature-length animated films. The breadth of this adaptation work reflects the franchise's cultural penetration beyond the gaming audience. Some of these adaptations are considered canonical by Capcom, others are clearly licensed entertainment that operates independently of the game's lore. The S.S.D. Perry novel series, which adapted the first 5 games and added original stories set between them, took various liberties with the canonical material that subsequent games occasionally contradicted, but the novels remain fondly remembered by fans who encountered them in the early 2000s. Fact 174. Resident Evil 4 has been released on more distinct platforms than any other game in the franchise's history. The original release was on GameCube in January 2005, followed within the same year by a PlayStation 2 version. After that came a Windows PC port, a Wii version with motion controls, an iOS mobile port, an HD edition for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, ports for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, a Nintendo Switch version, a virtual reality version for MetaQuest, and ultimately the 2023 full remake for current generation hardware. Each platform brought something slightly different to the experience. The Wii version's motion controls, where players physically aim their controller to shoot, proved surprisingly effective. The VR version transformed the over-the-shoulder perspective into full spatial immersion. The 2023 remake rebuilt everything from the ground up. There have been 13 distinct commercial versions of Resident Evil 4. Each one found an audience. Facts: 175. Everything in the Resident Evil franchise. The zombies, the bioweapons, the corporations, the cover-ups, the catastrophes, the survivors fighting through impossible circumstances with whatever they could find, traces back to one original decision. In 1989, Tokuro Fujiwara made a horror game about a haunted mansion for a Nintendo console that most Western players never experienced. He was proud of that game. He thought it represented something valuable and unexplored in video games. And years later, when he had the opportunity, he gave a young director with no horror game experience and a team of people who had mostly been making Disney tie-in games the task of trying to make something that captured what that original game had felt like, but better, for a new platform, with new technology, for a global audience. They were given 27 months. They invented the survival horror genre. And then they spent the next 30 years trying to top themselves, failing sometimes, succeeding brilliantly at others, reinventing the formula when it stopped working, and building a universe so rich and detailed and strange that people still gather in dark rooms to absorb new pieces of it, 30 years later, in the middle of the night, wherever they happen to be in the world. And that is 175 facts about Resident Evil. If you made it this far, genuinely, thank you. These long-form deep dives take a lot of work to put together properly, and the fact that you stayed with it all the way through means more than you might think. If this was the kind of video that hits the spot for you, the subscribe button is right there, and every single subscriber genuinely helps keep this going. A like also goes a long way toward making sure more people find videos like this one. Drop a comment if you want. Tell me what fact surprised you most. Tell me which era of Resident Evil means the most to you. Tell me if you have a topic you want to see covered next time. I read them all. Now, get some rest. You have earned it. Bonus deep dives, extended lore, lost games, and strange corners of the franchise. Since we have come this far together, let me take a little more time on some threads that deserve the extra space. On the subject of Raccoon City's design philosophy, the city was always meant to feel like a real American Midwestern town that happened to have been quietly consumed by corporate influence over decades. Umbrella did not storm in and take over Raccoon City dramatically. They funded the local economy, they provided employment, they contributed to civic projects. The hospital had Umbrella equipment, the police department had Umbrella connections. By the time the outbreak started, the city had become so financially dependent on Umbrella that the institutions that should have sounded the alarm were the same institutions Umbrella had been quietly cultivating for years. The cover-up was not just a last-minute emergency measure. It was built into the city's infrastructure. The horror of Raccoon City is not just the zombies in the streets. It is the 30 years of institutional capture that made the zombies possible. On the subject of what the Resident Evil remake in 2002 actually changed, the GameCube remake did not simply update the graphics of the original PlayStation game. It added entirely new areas, new enemies, new narrative elements, and new mechanics. The Crimson Heads, for instance, zombies that would reanimate in a faster and more dangerous form if killed without being burned, were created specifically for the remake. The original game had no such mechanic. The addition fundamentally changed the risk calculus of every zombie encounter because killing something was no longer necessarily permanent. The Lisa Trevor subplot, which gives the Spencer mansion a deeply personal history of cruelty and explains one of the original game's stranger lore elements, was entirely new content created for the remake. The remake is arguably a richer and more complete version of the original game's story. On the subject of Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil 0, which serves as a prequel to the original game and follows Rebecca Chambers and escaped convict Billy Cohen in the hours before the Spencer Mansion incident, was one of the most technically troubled games in the franchise's history. It was originally designed for the Nintendo 64. The N64 version was actually substantially complete before Capcom made the decision to move the game to GameCube. The development team essentially had to rebuild a nearly finished game for an entirely different platform. The final GameCube version shipped in 2002. The N64 version, which featured slightly different design decisions to account for that platform's different storage and processing characteristics, was never released, though documentation and partial assets from it have been discussed in Capcom materials. On the subject of how the franchise handled player anxiety, one of the design philosophies that runs through the entire survival horror era of Resident Evil, roughly from 1996 through 2003, is the deliberate management of player resource anxiety. You were almost never comfortable with how much ammunition you had. You were almost never certain you had enough herbs. The inventory was almost always too small for everything you wanted to carry. Every item pickup forced a decision. Every save ribbon used was a small expenditure. These were not accidents of design. They were careful calibrations intended to produce a specific emotional state. Not panic, which is too acute to sustain for long, but a kind of sustained low-level dread. The feeling that you might be okay, but you might not be, and you do not have quite enough information to know for certain. That sustained uncertainty was the engine of the franchise's horror during those years, and losing sight of it during the action-heavy era of Resident Evil 5 and 6 is what made those games feel tonally wrong to the fan base. On the subject of Resident Evil's influence on other franchises, Dead Space borrowed heavily from the Resident Evil 4 template while adding its own layer of body horror. The Last of Us drew from Resident Evil's survival mechanics, its relationship between resource management and emotional investment, and its use of fungal biology as a narrative framework. Silent Hill, while following its own distinct philosophy about psychological horror versus biological horror, was developed partly in response to what Resident Evil had established. The over-the-shoulder third-person camera that Resident Evil 4 popularized became the standard perspective for action games and third-person shooters across an entire decade. When you are playing games that feel nothing like Resident Evil, you are often playing in a space that Resident Evil helped define. On the subject of the franchise's music, the Resident Evil franchise has produced some genuinely memorable musical work across its 30 years. The original game's save room themes, slow, melancholy piano pieces that offered a brief sense of safety in hostile environments, became iconic. Resident Evil 2's soundtrack used a recurring three-note leitmotif across multiple compositions to create a sense of thematic continuity as the game's mood shifted between action and dread. Resident Evil 4's score mixed Spanish guitar with horror orchestration in ways that felt specific to the game's setting and tone. And Resident Evil Village brought fully orchestral scope to the franchise, with Lady Dimitrescu's castle having a score that genuinely sounded like something from a Gothic period film. Music in horror games does a kind of emotional heavy lifting that is easy to undervalue until you try playing those games with the sound off and realize how much the atmosphere depends on it. On the subject of games that were canceled entirely, the franchise has a graveyard of projects that never reached players. Beyond the multiple versions of Resident Evil 4 that were discarded, there was a planned PSP entry that got no further than a logo. There was a serious pitch from Creative Assembly, the studio behind Alien Isolation, to make a Resident Evil game for Capcom. That pitch apparently went through some early conversations before nothing came of it. There were plans for a third Resident Evil Outbreak game that never materialized, and there have been various mobile and handheld projects at different points in the franchise's history that entered and exited development without leaving much trace. The games that do get made represent only a fraction of what is proposed and begun. On the subject of the franchise's relationship with Japan versus the West, Resident Evil has always occupied an interesting position as a Japanese product designed with significant awareness of Western horror conventions. The zombie films that informed the original game's visual vocabulary, George Romero's work being the most prominent, were American. The live-action FMV sequences used American actors. The fictional American settings were researched through photography and reference materials. And yet the game was created by a Japanese team with Japanese sensibilities about pacing, puzzle design, and the relationship between player and environment. The result was something genuinely hybrid, a game that felt American in its surface aesthetic and Japanese in its design philosophy, and that combination contributed significantly to its cross-cultural appeal. On the subject of Resident Evil's sound design, the sound design across the franchise deserves far more credit than it typically receives. The specific groan of a zombie hearing footsteps, the wet, organic sound of mutation in a boss fight, the silence that follows after clearing a room, and then suddenly being uncertain whether that silence is safe. The franchise's audio team has consistently used sound to create spatial awareness and emotional priming in ways that players often process without consciously noticing. The opening sounds of Resident Evil 7, the crackling of the recording that Mia sent to Ethan, the ambient insect noise of the Louisiana swamp, were designed to begin establishing mood before a single piece of gameplay had occurred. On the subject of how Resident Evil 4's influence is still being felt, when From Software designers discuss the structure of Dark Souls, they reference games like Resident Evil 4 in the context of exploration design and how environments reward careful attention. When narrative-focused action game studios discuss player agency and decision-making, they often reference Resident Evil 4's attaché case as one of the most elegant implementations of inventory management as a gameplay layer. The mechanic of upgrading individual weapons over the course of a game rather than simply finding better weapons was popularized by Resident Evil 4 in a way that felt new to mainstream audiences. These design elements did not originate entirely with Resident Evil 4, but the game packaged them with such commercial and critical success that they spread across the industry in a way few other games have managed. On the subject of why Resident Evil 6 happened the way it did, Resident Evil 5 sold approximately 13 million copies, the best commercial performance of any single entry in the franchise's history at that point. The lesson Capcom drew from that success was that the action-oriented direction was commercially viable, potentially more commercially viable than the horror direction. Resident Evil 6 was the logical extreme of that reading. It was bigger, louder, and more action-focused than anything before it, with 3 separate campaigns running simultaneously and a production budget that reflected Capcom's confidence in the formula. The game sold approximately 7 million copies, still commercially significant but a dramatic step back from Resident Evil 5, and the critical response was among the worst in the franchise's history. The conversation around Resident Evil 6 within the industry was about whether the franchise had lost its identity completely. That conversation led directly to Resident Evil 7 being what it was. On the subject of what the Wesker Children Project says about Spencer, Project W is one of the most genuinely disturbing elements of the franchise's lore when you sit with it. Spencer did not simply create a genetics program. He identified children with exceptional inherited traits, took them from their families, gave them his scientist surname as though he owned them, and raised them in a controlled environment designed to produce loyal, exceptional instruments of his vision. He spent years monitoring them without their knowledge. He arranged for their education to be exceptional, and then he exposed the survivors of that upbringing to a prototype virus without their informed consent and waited to see which ones lived. The fact that the children who survived, Albert and Alex Wesker, both eventually turned against him so completely that they destroyed his life's work and killed him personally can be read as a kind of narrative justice. Spencer built his perfect successors, and his perfect successors decided they did not want to succeed him. They wanted to replace him. On the subject of the franchise's relationship with its own timeline, Resident Evil has one of the more complicated timelines in gaming, not because it lacks structure, but because so much supplementary material, drama CDs, novelizations, side games, and downloadable content has been produced over 30 years that maintaining perfect consistency is essentially impossible. Capcom's approach has generally been to treat the mainline games as the canonical spine of the timeline and to allow supplementary material to exist in a slightly looser relationship with that spine. Some of the most interesting lore in the franchise lives in supplementary materials that a significant portion of the player base has never encountered. The drama albums produced for the Japanese market during the Raccoon City era told stories of the outbreak from perspectives the games never showed. Some of those stories were eventually incorporated into the game canon in modified forms. On the subject of what makes a Resident Evil game feel like a Resident Evil game, this question has no single answer, and the franchise's history is partly a record of different eras trying to figure out what the answer should be. The early games suggested it was resource scarcity, fixed cameras, and a specific relationship between exploration and horror. Resident Evil 4 suggested it was a particular kind of tense, escalating action with inventive set pieces and memorable antagonists. Resident Evil 7 and Village suggested it was intimacy, the sense that the threat was personal and close. The remakes have suggested that the original game's structures are still valid when rebuilt with modern technology. The truth is probably that Resident Evil is defined less by any specific mechanical choice, and more by a consistent willingness to take horror seriously, to build worlds where the danger feels meaningful, and to ask players to engage with that danger with limited resources and limited information. On the subject of what comes next, Resident Evil Requiem launched in February 2026 and returned Leon Kennedy to Raccoon City, now in ruins decades after its destruction. The ninth mainline entry in the franchise continued the series' pattern of finding new angles on its own history, while expanding the lore in directions that create questions for future entries. Whether the franchise will eventually revisit Ethan Winters, whether it will explore what Rose Winters becomes as she grows up, whether it will finally explain what the Duke and the Merchant actually are, whether it will reconcile the many threads it has left hanging across 30 years of storytelling, remains to be seen. The franchise has always found ways to keep going. It has always found something new to say about survival, about institutions and the damage they do, and about what it costs to keep fighting through something that should, by any reasonable measurement, have already destroyed you. That is the nature of survival horror. You should not have made it this far. But here you are. Extended notes on individual facts worth extra time. Let me spend a little longer on a few of the entries that deserve more than a paragraph. The story of Resident Evil 1.5 deserves more time because it is one of the most fascinating development cautionary tales in the medium. Think about what it means to throw away 60 to 70% of a finished game. Not a prototype, not an early concept, a game that was substantially playable, that had its major systems working, that had enemies and environments and story and characters. Capcom scrapped all of that because the producer played through it and found it insufficiently distinctive. That is an enormous creative and financial decision. And the thing is, from everything that has been documented about Resident Evil 1.5, it was actually a competent, functional game. Director Hideki Kamiya himself said in a social media post, responding to a fan who asked if 1.5 was bad enough to restart its project from scratch, that it was about as good as any other common game. The problem was that common was not acceptable. The original Resident Evil had defined a genre. Its sequel had to do something more than exist. The bar had been raised by the first game's own success, and Resident Evil 1.5 could not clear it. What is remarkable is that the rebuild, done in approximately a year and 9 months, produced one of the most acclaimed games of the PlayStation era. The pressure of starting over from scratch, the clarity of knowing exactly why the first version had failed, and the involvement of a professional screenwriter who understood story structure gave the team a kind of focused, creative energy that the first attempt had lacked. Sometimes the most productive thing that can happen in a creative project is the clearest possible feedback that what you are making is not working yet. The story of Shinji Mikami threatening to cut his own head off also deserves more time. Not for the drama of it, but for what it reveals about the relationship between creative people and commercial decisions. Mikami genuinely believed that exclusive release on GameCube was the right decision for Resident Evil 4. He believed it so strongly that he made a public, memorable statement about it. And then Capcom made the business decision that contradicted his belief, and the game was ported to PlayStation 2 within months. His reaction was to leave the company. He did not cause a scene or take legal action or try to prevent the port. He expressed his disagreement clearly, it was overruled, and he left. The game that he created went on to be ported to more than 13 different platforms over the following 2 decades. The work he made outlasted his relationship with the company in every conceivable way. That is a strange and entirely typical creative industry story. The cultural impact of Lady Dimitrescu also deserves extended attention. When Capcom first revealed her in the marketing materials for Resident Evil Village, the internet's response was immediate and overwhelming, and it was not just about fear. She was tall, She was aristocratic. She was frightening in a specific way that felt distinct from the franchise's usual monster vocabulary, and people found that combination compelling in ways that went well beyond the normal discourse around a new horror game villain. Capcom's marketing team made the decision to lean into that response by putting her at the center of almost every piece of promotional material. And the interesting thing is that she is not actually the central antagonist of the game. Mother Miranda is the central antagonist. Dimitrescu is one of 4 lords who serve as mid-game obstacles, but the public attachment to the character was so strong that the marketing positioned her as the face of the entire game, which created some interesting expectations about how large her role would be. Players who expected her to be a constant presence across the full game were sometimes surprised by how the third act resolved, but the character's cultural footprint remains enormous, and she continues to appear prominently in Capcom's Resident Evil marketing materials years after the game's release. The subject of Resident Evil 7's VR implementation deserves its own moment. When Resident Evil 7 launched in January 2017, it was one of the most high-profile uses of PlayStation 5 R technology to date. The entire game was playable in virtual reality, not just a section or a specific mode, the complete game. You could put on the headset and spend the entire 10 hours of Ethan Winters' Nightmare in immersive first-person virtual reality inside the Baker estate. The development team spent significant resources ensuring that the VR implementation would not cause motion sickness in a game that required moving through tight, anxiety-inducing corridors. The response from players who experienced it that way was intense. It is frequently described as one of the most genuinely frightening VR experiences available. The hardware limitations of PlayStation 5 R meant the image quality was reduced compared to playing on a television, but the loss in visual fidelity was more than compensated by the immediacy of the experience. The way the franchise handles its own continuity is also worth extended discussion. There is a document within the Resident Evil lore called the Spencer Memoirs, accessible in Resident Evil 5, in which Oswell Spencer himself writes about his motivations, his philosophy, and his relationship with his co-founders. Reading it is one of the stranger experiences the franchise offers. Spencer is lucid, intelligent, and genuinely articulate about his own horror. He does not frame his actions as evil. He frames them as necessary. The distance between his self-image and what he actually did to the world is enormous, and the document captures that distance with a disturbing matter-of-factness. He believed completely in what he was doing. He never stopped believing in it. The fact that it killed him, that the most successful product of his eugenics program used that program's results to come to his home and end his life, is the kind of irony that the franchise rarely acknowledges directly, but builds into its structural bones. The physical settings of Resident Evil games deserve more attention as works of environmental design. The Spencer Mansion, with its combination of domestic architecture and secret laboratory, communicates something specific about the relationship between the public-facing and the hidden. The Raccoon City police station, with its museum origins visible in its ornate construction, communicates something about the city's history and the way institutions persist even after their original purpose has changed. Castle Dimitrescu, with its layered history of wine production and darker activities, communicates the way a place accumulates meaning over generations. The Baker estate, with its military memorabilia and its gradual descent from a well-maintained family home into something organic and corrupted, communicates the speed at which Evelyn's infection transformed a living space. Each of these environments is doing narrative work independently of the dialogue and cutscenes. The space itself is telling you something about the world you are in. The subject of Ada Wong's long-term narrative arc across the franchise is another thread that could fill a much longer video on its own. She appears in Resident Evil 2 as a supporting character, with murky allegiances and a dying relationship with Leon that is never quite resolved. She reappears in Resident Evil 4, working for Wesker while subtly sabotaging his plan. She has her own campaign in that game that significantly recontextualizes events. She appears again in Resident Evil 6 in a deeply complicated storyline involving a duplicate of herself and the C virus. And in the Resident Evil 4 remake, her characterization was revised to make her emotional relationship with Leon and her motivations considerably clearer than they had been in previous versions of the same events. She is one of the franchise's most consistently interesting characters, precisely because so much of her story has been told in implication and retroactive context rather than direct exposition. What the franchise has consistently done well, across all of its different eras and tonal variations, is create villains with comprehensible motivations. Spencer wanted to build a better humanity according to his vision. Wesker wanted to transcend the limitations he had been designed to accept. Birkin wanted to keep his work from being taken from him. Baker family before the infection were decent people who happened to be in the wrong place when Evelyn arrived. Miranda wanted her daughter back. These are not abstract evil drives. They are recognizable human impulses pushed past every reasonable limit by intelligence, access, and the removal of normal social constraints. The franchise asks quietly, what any of us might become if we had the knowledge and the resources and the desperation and the absence of accountability. It does not answer the question. That is the point. One more pass. Things that did not fit elsewhere. There are details about this franchise that are worth documenting, even when they resist easy categorization. The way the franchise handles save systems is something that players internalize so deeply they stop noticing it. The original games used ink ribbons and typewriters as the save mechanism. You found a typewriter, you used an ink ribbon from your limited inventory, and you saved. The ribbon was not free. Using it cost you a resource. This created a specific kind of save psychology. Players would delay saving, trying to accumulate a few more ribbons or conserve the ones they had, which meant that if something went wrong in the time since their last save, more progress was at risk. This amplified the stakes of every encounter. Running into Mr. X without having saved recently was not just stressful in the moment. It was stressful because of all the time and progress that was riding on the outcome. Later games removed the ribbon mechanic, but the typewriter remained as a save point, eventually becoming iconic as a visual symbol that you were in a safe space, at least temporarily. The specific texture of fear that Resident Evil produces, at its best, is different from the texture of fear in most other horror games. It is not the jump scare, though the franchise uses jump scares effectively. It is the sustained awareness that something could be around the next corner, that the resource you just used might be the one you needed 3 rooms from now, that the decision you made 3 minutes ago might have been a mistake you will not discover until it is too late. That kind of anticipatory dread requires careful design. It requires giving the player just enough information to be worried, without giving them enough to be certain. The games that have done it best in the franchise are the ones where the player is almost never comfortable, but is also almost never completely hopeless. That narrow band between comfort and despair is where the best survival horror lives. The character of Leon S. Kennedy has had one of the more interesting evolutions of any character across multiple games in gaming history. He starts as an idealistic rookie cop in Resident Evil 2, completely overwhelmed by his first day on the job. He becomes, in his subsequent appearances, increasingly competent and increasingly burdened by competence. By Resident Evil 4, he has become a quipping, efficient government operative who is very good at his job and somewhat wearied by being very good at his job. The humor he developed by that game, the sardonic one-liners delivered in life-threatening situations, reads as the coping mechanism of someone who has been in too many impossible situations to process them through normal emotional channels. And in later appearances, especially the Resident Evil 2 remake and Resident Evil 6, the weight of everything he has survived begins to show more visibly. He is still competent. He is still funny. But the distance between the young rookie who was terrified in the police station and the experienced agent who walks into global bioterrorism crises with dry remarks is also a measure of everything those experiences cost. The franchise's ongoing project of dealing with corporate accountability and institutional horror is worth acknowledging in its own right. Resident Evil has been, from its very first game, interested in the question of what happens when a corporation operates without oversight. Spencer's umbrella was not just a generic evil organization. It was a pharmaceutical corporation with real public health products and a genuine presence in the global economy that used its financial and institutional power to pursue a private agenda that required mass atrocity. The people at the top understood what they were doing. The people at the bottom mostly did not. The scientists in the labs were working on research problems. The security personnel were doing their jobs. The pharmacists selling Safsprin had no idea. The franchise has never been particularly subtle about this commentary, but it has been consistent. Every new organization that emerges after Umbrella's collapse, the Connections, Tricell, the organizations in Resident Evil 6, demonstrates the same structural pattern. The goals change. The methods and the willingness to sacrifice human beings for institutional purposes remain constant. Chris Redfield's arc across the franchise is also worth a sustained look. He starts as one of the original Resident Evil's two protagonists, a straightforward hero in a mansion full of monsters. He spends the next several games in the role of the capable, principled soldier who does the right thing even when it costs him something. And then Resident Evil 5 introduces a version of Chris who is clearly carrying significant psychological weight from years of this work, who loses a colleague to Wesker's cruelty, who fights through grief and anger to defeat the franchise's central villain. And then there is the Chris of Resident Evil 6 and onward, who makes increasingly difficult choices with increasingly uncertain moral clarity, until we reach the Chris of Village who shoots someone he believes to be a person in Ethan's home and sets in motion the catastrophe the game documents. His journey from hero to someone who operates in genuinely complicated moral territory mirrors the franchise's own journey from clean-cut monster shooting to something messier and more interesting. The question the franchise keeps returning to, across every era and every creative reinvention, is this: what would you do? What would you do with knowledge, with resources, with desperation, with grief, with the absence of anyone to stop you? The franchise's answer, expressed through 30 years of games and characters and choices, is that most people would rationalize their way into things they would find unthinkable under normal circumstances. That most institutions that begin with good intentions eventually build structures that protect the institution rather than the purpose it was created to serve. That survival and compassion are sometimes in genuine conflict, and that choosing which one wins defines you. It does not offer easy answers. It does not redeem most of its villains or make their actions acceptable, but it insists, repeatedly and with genuine conviction, that understanding how things went wrong is more valuable than simply condemning the fact that they went wrong at all. That is what makes it worth spending this kind of time with. Not the jump scares, not the over-the-shoulder combat, not even the monsters, though the monsters are spectacular. It is the seriousness with which the franchise has always treated the question of how good people, average people, and brilliant, terrible people all end up building the same catastrophes over and over. The village burns. The knowledge survives. And somewhere, right now, someone is beginning another experiment. The characters who defined eras. Before we close this out, let me spend a few hundred more words on the characters who have most shaped what Resident Evil means as a cultural artifact. Jill Valentine is the original Resident Evil character in every meaningful sense. She was there in 1996 when the franchise began, designed as one of two playable protagonists with distinct capabilities. She was there in Resident Evil 3 when the franchise went big and operatic. She was there in Resident Evil 5 as a corrupted ally that the player had to fight and save, representing an era when the franchise's emotional ambitions were running ahead of its mechanical ones. And she continues to be present in remake after remake, with each generation of technology giving the design team a new opportunity to find something true in the character they built in 1993. The tube top and the skirt became the tactical gear of Resident Evil 3, became the BSAA uniform, became every subsequent iteration. The woman inside the outfit, the self-possessed, technically excellent, emotionally grounded person who survived the Spencer Mansion and Raccoon City and everything after, has remained consistent across all of it. Claire Redfield has a particular kind of earnestness that the franchise does not always celebrate, but consistently returns to. She came to Raccoon City looking for her brother. She stayed to protect a 10-year-old child she did not know. She went to Rockford Island to rescue her brother and found Alexia Ashford and Code Veronica instead. She appears in animated films and in the Revelations spin-off and always brings the same quality. A person who has no business surviving in the situations she finds herself in and who survives them anyway through a combination of competence, stubbornness, and genuine care for the people around her. She is arguably the franchise's most straightforwardly heroic figure, which is perhaps why she does not always get the same kind of dark character analysis that Leon or Chris receive. But straightforward heroism done well is its own difficult thing to write and play. Rebecca Chambers as a character has done more with less screen time than perhaps any other figure in the franchise. She appeared as a supporting character in the original game, a teenager by the standards of the STARS unit, clearly out of her depth and clearly unwilling to admit it. She got her own game in Resident Evil Zero that documented her first night in the field, and then she essentially disappeared from the mainline series for decades while continuing to appear in spin-offs, animated films, and promotional materials. The fandom's affection for her has remained strong in that absence in a way that says something about the effectiveness of her original characterization. A character who was in one game as a supporting player and one game as the lead has maintained a fan presence comparable to characters with far more screen time, because the two appearances she has are genuinely good. And then there is Albert Wesker, who deserves one final note. The franchise's central villain for its first decade and more was not simply a generic power-hungry antagonist. He was a man whose entire sense of self had been constructed for him by someone else, who discovered that constructed self was a lie, and who responded to that discovery by deciding to become the god the man who had built him had imagined. Spencer had wanted a world of exceptional humans under his guidance. Wesker decided to take that vision and remove the Spencer from it, the eugenicist who was himself the product of a eugenics program. The man designed to serve someone else's vision who chose to make it his own and then die for it inside a volcano. There is something almost classically tragic about the arc, if you squint at it correctly. Almost. Everything comes back to the cave in 1919. Everything comes back to a mother touching something ancient in the dark and deciding that death was a problem biology could solve. Everything comes back to one young director who had just finished making a game about Goofy being handed the task of making the most frightening game in the world. Everything comes back to decisions made in small rooms that rippled outward across 30 years and 170 million copies, and a franchise that is still going. That is 175 facts. That is where they come from. That is what they mean. Rest well. The village will be here when you wake up.